Hello, everybody. It's been, pretty sure it's been over a year since I've uploaded anything here. I've been continuing to do the basic alchemical work of self-discovery. And I've learned a number of very important things about myself over the last year. And one of those things, probably the biggest thing, is that I have borderline personality. And so that's why this video is titled Synchronicity and Borderline Personality. The two things are actually quite related. You'll notice that I've refrained in the title here from saying borderline personality disorder, which is the common terminology for it, BPD. And that's because I think there's unfortunately, a very robust tradition of conflating marginality with pathology. It's an immensely stigmatized way to be, and a very painful way to be. And so I acknowledge that there are pathological components to it. And at times in my life, it has definitely been a disorder. And at times in my life today, it still causes me an inordinate amount of pain. It also causes me quite a lot of joy. And also, it is a force of order. So, this situation is a bit more complex than the mainstream attitudes about it might have you believe. The story of my... So, first of all, my hope here is that this information might be useful to people that are following this channel that might be a bit like me. So, I don't necessarily mean to suggest that you too may be a borderliner, although you may be. But if you're someone who's interested in the ideational style that is presented on this channel, which has to do with a very outsider approach to the way we think about patterns and information and so on, you are probably somebody who is sensitive to the feeling of being very much on the outside of consensus opinion, consensus attitudes, consensus ways of being. A serious difference of perspective counts for a lot. It can count for a lot negatively, but can also count for a lot positively. So if you're an atypical personality, I just want to say, I intensely feel your pain, and this is a place where we don't have to worry about that. There's no such thing as a neurotypical here on Sync Century. You're not allowed to watch. No, I'm just kidding. I hope you're watching neurotypicals of the world. But I think that there's a difficult line here, because I think that part of the nervousness we have as outsiders is that if we admit to having any kind of a mental health issue, we worry that it's going to blow back onto our work, you know? As much as it's nice to emphasize the commonality, and of course there's lots of commonality, we're all people after all. We're not that different from one another. But we're still different in ways that count. And myself and others in the sync community are different enough that I think there's a palpable anxiety, at least, about that. Alchemy is, first of all, about self-knowledge and about self-discovery. So inasmuch as I'm trying to be an example of a good alchemist, it's important for me to be as open as possible with all aspects of the work. It's actually something that I'll be building up to here is an argument that the alchemists, many of the alchemists were probably borderline personalities. I think that we develop the medicines that we need. So the fact that the alchemical knowledge is so useful to a borderline personality is, to my mind, a bit of soft evidence that the people that made that remedy were dealing with borderline-like problems if they weren't dealing with a full-on borderline sort of situation. But so, okay, some definitions. So here's kind of the starting attitude that seems to exist. The standard attitude about this is that you have normal people, let's use an N for them, and then you have crazies. And maybe you have just kind of a few crazies and a whole lot of normal people. Just a quick note about that, I would say that today, increasingly, very many people probably feel that it's more like this. This is a result of the fracturing and polarization of worldviews in our civilization. So it starts to look like, and what's important about this is it starts to look like this kind of the situation, the social situation, starts to look like this to everybody at the same time. So this is a big group effect that's happening together. It starts to seem like you're living in a world where there's a very small number of people that seem normal to you, in other words, that seem like you, and a huge number of people that all seem like they're crazy relative to what you believe and what you take to be real in the world. I would say even today, in US of A 2022, this is trending in the direction of being actually the predominant feeling. If you ask people, they'll still say this, though. And they will want to believe this. This is kind of an alarming and it's a distressing worldview that you kind of only develop if you've already popped through the consensus reality barrier for some reason. Maybe you've been ejected from it. It loves to do that, just to make atypicals walk the plank and sadistically torture them and all this kind of stuff. The hegemony is very excellent at doing that. So maybe it ejected you. Maybe you left it for some other reason. That's kind of like what happened to me. I was on a trajectory in my thinking that opened up some very specific doors in my head that then led to this confrontation with the idea of the unconscious that then changed my attitude about this. But just to remind us of the overarching point of why I'm talking about any of this, because this view is scary to people that are within the consensus reality still, they're gonna cling to this view because this feels safe. The whole reason that these people are in this thing, and the reason why anybody is in this thing, a social body, I mean, is or not the whole reason, but a big part of it is that it provides this kind of safety in numbers. And it prevents you from having to ask too many uncomfortable questions yourself about what's true, what's false, what's good, what's bad. I don't know. I'm just a confused humanoid. And so I receive my opinions from the big consensus opinions that the social body makes available to me. And so I know that there are some people that don't get their models from that. They get their models from weird, scary places like back alleys of the internet, or actual books that contain ideas, or talking to specific groups of people that generally people dwelling within N would view to be unsavory, or et cetera, et cetera. So they accept that there are some people that possess this thing. These are like weird mutant worldviews, but we imagine that they're few and far between, and so that's a way for the hegemonic structure to be comfortable with a truth about influence from the margins, which is that these social bodies that define a kind of a Gaussian distribution of normalness, periodically shuffle around a bit, and the standards, the sort of the stock templates that it offers to its denizens in the way of identities, get updated. Maybe some new ones get introduced, and some old ones get removed, and maybe still some other ones change or fracture up into some tinier ones, or combine into some new kinds of composites, or but the things that motivate that tend to be influences from the margins. So although those influences are not presently having any kind of effect, because it's just some bunch of crazies over here in this circle that may never touch the circle of normality, it periodically does touch, because it's something in here becomes supercharged by a shift in context at a higher level. So some new crisis happens that nobody anticipated, or just some transformation happens geopolitically, world historically, where suddenly a different kind of perspective matters. A different kind of perspective is useful. And then these things that before were these like weird outlier, long-shotty kind of attitudes, they might suddenly become exactly the attitudes that generate success in the new state of play. And so because that's true, the consensus world is very afraid of those marginal influences because they're like invisible, powerful things that might someday upset the social order. And then individuals that were marginalized before might become unmarginalized in the new situation. And that's all part of something that we talk about in ecology in terms, and just increasingly in complexity, generally speaking, in terms of the adaptive cycle. Okay, this is just a way that complex adaptive systems adapt through time. And so these big things, civilizations, social bodies, they'll just kind of repress that awareness. They'll repress that fear of the margins. They just prefer not to think about it, and so that's why they like to imagine these as two completely separate circles. An improvement to this model could be had if we were to draw a Venn diagram like this, where we have the normals and the crazies, and then some kind of normal crazies in the intersect of normals and crazies. Because, of course, if you're looking at the world slightly more objectively than this kind of severe kind of panic repress worldview, it can be observed that there are all kinds of people in the middle. And actually, I think this model could be very much improved if we scaled the relative areas such that it looked a bit more like this, you know. Most people are somewhere in a kind of a murky middle. And then you have a minority of people, probably, that this is the irony of it, is you have a minority of people that conform to the social definition of whatever normal is. Scare quotes intentional here. And a minority of people that really hyper don't conform to it. Most people are somewhere in a complex intersection. This social body tends to be set up in such a way that it rewards conformity with its definitions of normality. There are interesting back passageways and things like this that it can sometimes reward abnormality as well. In fact, there's a specific subsection in here that's like, if you have the right combination of normal and abnormal, you can sort of skyrocket probably to the top of these things. But because the social structure rewards conformity with this, it means that people have an incentive to minimize the ways in which they belong to crazy and maximize the ways in which they belong to normal. And so particularly in the construction of their personas, they just emphasize all the stuff that society rewards, and they repress or only express in private or only to very certain trusted people the parts that society at large doesn't reward. That's just having a good strategy in life, you know. But the problem with this is that works really well if you're capable of doing that. If you're kind of more over here than you are over here, if you know what I mean. If you basically conform to this, but there's just a few kind of outliery aspects of your personality that make you weird in a way that's actually unpalatable, because there's also a difference between this kind of outlier and the kind of like forms of outlier that the culture will allow you to be. Like, you can be a nerd, you can be a metalhead, you can be really into tap dancing, you know, you can be weird in various ways that the society will just say, that's okay because that's a quirk. But if you're weird in this deeper sort of way, you start to be scary and threatening, even if people won't admit that because maybe it's not socially acceptable. It's not polite to say that. Say, I'm afraid of you because you're a nutcase, you know? If you're over here in firmly outside of this intersection, it just sort of doesn't pay you to even try to do this necessarily, you know? I'm a big believer in optimizing one's own mental garden. I have to be a believer in that because my garden is wild. So it requires like every possible gardening technique to keep it working at something like in some kind of functional way. A big part about having an optimal mental garden is having this nice thing called a persona that allows you to interface with society, which is this weird, specific, shared reality that the adults of a given civilization partake of. Children are less in this thing, and the elderly are less in this thing, and also the crazies are less in this thing. But normal adults, and by here I'm not sure if I mean normal in terms of the majority, or normal in terms of people who conform to this standard of normality that is that we expect the majority to comply with, or something like that, you know. But in any case, this social system expects you to be this or be able to fake being this enough to make this whole game continue to work, where everybody believes in this as the exhaustive definition of reality, more or less. And so, if you find that you can inhabit this world with just by just omitting or modifying a few aspects of yourself that maybe aren't even core aspects, then you have an optimized persona. Because no persona is going to be identical, probably, with the true interior state of the personality. It's going to be a complexity reduction. It's a particular subset of your possibility space as a personality, you know. It's the public you. It's the you put on when you go to parties, you know. It's the you that you put on when you go to work. Those might be slightly different personas, but they're both personas that are fulfilling the function of the persona, which is to interface you with the social world that doesn't know how to deal, really, with the transcendental complexity that exists inside of every human being. Because human beings are so radiant in that way, we can't relate to each other with that full radiance in groups, at least not at this moment historically. I wonder if we wouldn't be able to create a future where we could all exist with that, with a shared awareness of our respective divinities, even in the group context. That's very hard. And we're certainly very, very, very far away from that today. And so because of that, what the group knows how to deal with is a kind of a cartoon version of a person, a little kind of robotized version of a person that has really restricted what in cybernetics we would call its variety, its number of possible states. It's going to be less complex so that the social game knows how to process it and knows how to, and everyone just kind of agrees together that in order to have this social game, we're going to perform this complexity crunch on ourselves. I hate that. I just almost always hate it. And so I really prefer to hang out with people one-on-one or in small groups. 4 is too much for me already, really. 3 is a good number. 2 is ideal. But by the time you get to 4, there's a hive. There's some kind of a group-mindy dynamic takes over. And things like the scapegoat mechanism start becoming much more likely to be instantiated in ways that are often subtle. It doesn't always have to be like a true scapegoat, like blood sacrifice sort of situation. It can just be about who the group selects to be the butt of every joke or things like this, you know. Well, so I have a persona that lets me pass here. And I'm borderline. We have yet to talk about that still, but part of what that means is that I'm very good at just pulling out some personality in order to make people like me. I'm a huge chameleon in that way, actually, if I allow myself to be. And I can endear myself to almost any group of people just by observing them a bit first, learning what makes them tick, and then emulating that. I like performing, obviously. I have a fucking YouTube channel, But for me, this performative aspect, this performance of normality, is very painful, actually, and something that I've come to view as quite destructive. And so, if you're like me, you have to turn off so many aspects of yourself and then just kind of wholesale invent a bunch of completely performative aspects to yourself in order to approximate what the social body considers to be normal. You end up with a persona that essentially nullifies your identity. To the extent that you're performing this persona, normality, your true identity actually recedes into the unconscious. If you're wearing this persona all day long, all the time, this is a horrible situation to be in. One thing here, just to say right away, we were talking about these models, we were stuck with these Venn diagrams, and I want to replace all of that because it's not really like that, I don't think. It's more like there are many dimensions of normality. So you can be very abnormal in certain ways, of course, and very normal in other ways. And so, in certain ways, I am extremely normal. I have extremely normal, like, white dude tastes in food, for instance. Like, I am a turkey sandwich guy, like, down to the bone, And that's so, and it's so, the normality of that is, to me, that's painful. It's painful in a whole different way than the abnormal parts of me. It's painful because it's so predictable. It's just it's embarrassing and just kind of So anyway, I just want to say I get that a little bit. I get that to just be normal maybe isn't so great. There's a pain that goes along with that as well. But wow, holy shit, is there a pain that goes along with being seriously abnormal? That people who haven't really had to deal with that in a substantive way just don't seem to have any kind of appreciation for. I mean, how could they? It's not a problem that they can locate a referent for in their own phenomenological pathway through the world. They don't know what that feeling is like to be reduced to this tiny little pocket while this giant fake, like, puppet version of yourself walks around in its, this horrific person suit that you're wearing. This is really suboptimal. And so I've become a master of the borderline, the threshold of how weird can I be in a group without making myself too much of a target for scapegoaty violence of various kinds on the one hand, but also without feeling like I need to employ very destructive borderline strategies that involve kind of emotionally manipulating other people and stuff like that in order to maintain my safety, which unfortunately, because it is part of my personality, like, I sometimes do that and I don't even realize I'm doing it, and then I'll like consciously catch it and have to like retract some insane strategy I was halfway in the middle of trying to enact in some social situation, etc. So, without getting too deep into this whole topic, I just want to say that I'm operating on the following model. My understanding of the human being is that they are split into something called an ego. And the ego is the conscious part. It's the part of you that's having a conscious experience, let's say that. And it's sitting inside of a psyche that is full of other complexes. Really, I'm going just to say other sources of intelligent organization that make up the unconscious. So the rest of this is the unconscious. And many other kinds of things. There's also memories. Here's some nice memories. There's a whole lot of just like mathy computation stuff, which is a lot of the stuff that actually has to do with kind of like rendering the conscious experience of the ego complex. So the ego complex seems to be special in that it's the only one that gets this elaborate sort of holodecky VR sim of the external world patched into it. It's probably the single most computationally expensive thing that the psyche does. In some way, my assumption is that all this other stuff is really kind of exists in reference to and flows in and out of this, really. It's all about the processing of experience. And the ego complex is just a very sort of specialized complex, which is to say subsystem in the complex adaptive system that constitutes the psyche, that has conscious experience. This is the world of consciousness. Now, a lot of the stuff going on in the unconscious has a particular style to it. This is a style that you can be familiar with through various channels. The direct source of awareness about it tends to come through dreams. So if you know what a dream is, then you know a bit about the style of the unconscious. You see it also in surreal art. And of course, surreal art is something that was developed in connection with dreams and with theories about the unconscious. Those were things that the surrealists were thinking about when they made these paintings. Many of them are sort of directly pulled from dream imagery and things like that. You'll also find it in the hallucinations of schizophrenics and other sorts of neuroatypical people. And Jung was a guy who noticed this connection very strongly between the dreams of non-psychotic patients, hallucinations and delusions of psychotic patients, and sort of cultural material like things in myths and religions, that these were all sharing a style. The thing about this style is that at the center of it is a particular kind of I don't know what to say about it. I was about to say frightening irrationality. I'm not sure it's actually so frightening. It's not so frightening to me. It's always a little creepy. I don't know. There's a reason I like to write in slime. You know, this thing is it just is a bit like that. It is a bit frightening, but there's a madness at the center of it. I mean, if you look at the center of any mythology or any religion, I mean, look at the center of Christian mythology. Christ is a mad idea. I mean, it's something absolutely just. There are like so many weird paradoxes built into it. I mean, Christ is interesting actually because he kind of codes the impossibility directly. In alchemy, we deal with that a little bit more abstractly, typically. It's the idea of squaring the circle, you know. Turns out that's an impossible thing to do, mathematically. But the alchemists didn't know that. It's just something that they were trying to do, though, and it ends up becoming symbolic of the idea of an attempt to do the impossible. You might think, well, why would you do that? And the answer would have to do with limits and asymptotes, maybe. Anyway, with Christ, it's about the performance of these miracles, raising the dead, walking on water, etc., etc. These are just, in a way, they're things that only a fool would believe. And so to believe them, you must really be some kind of fool. It's a wonderful thing to be that sort of a religious fool. To really believe in a myth. That's what we all did when we were little. We would believe in things. And then the imagination would come alive. And a doorway would be formed through which we could enter into the unconscious. And tend to the gardening, which is to say to the relations and inner functioning of these complexes in such a way that they could be made harmonious. Part of Jung's insight was that you could play certain games in the imagination that seemed to have the effect. It's as if these imagination games were like an interface for reconciling and healing information theoretic problems going on between these complexes. The thing about it is that very few people will do that because the imaginal interface, the world of dreams, or of daydreams, if you're doing a strict sort of Jungian active imagination. I used automatic drawing and other kinds of processes to get at this. But that language, that visual language, and that irrational core to it is frightening often to egos that haven't encountered it yet, bubbling up from within. It scares so many of the egos that are living in society normal, sort of sub-society normal, They have to believe in this idea of there's the crazy people and all that stuff lives in the crazy people, and then we're the normal, sane people, and we don't have any of those things. We're normal. In fact, everybody has this psychotic layer to their personality, which consists of these autonomous complexes whirring around in the unconscious. That's all happening beneath the veil of consciousness for most people. For me as a borderline personality, and then we're going to get to this in a second, it's happening very often above the threshold of consciousness, which is, by the way, a very isolating thing, because this whole story is a thing that most people in Society N don't know a ton about. They basically have no idea that this exists, really. And so this huge aspect, it's like the substance of my life, really, is totally invisible in this thing, usually. Because even if you kind of can figure out a way to explain this rapidly without making people watch a presentation with a pen, it's still, they don't get it. They don't get the profundity of this or the importance of it or something. So anyway, this is how I understand how we work. I mean, there's a lot more subtlety than that, but just to give sort of the basic picture. And so the problem of the borderline personality is that the ego complex is kind of not formed correctly. First of all, it's very porous. And so a huge part of this config is that emotions will spill into your conscious experience very rapidly and very totally. So I can go from a complete sort of baseline, normal affect, like I am now, to stratospheric levels of mania or completely abyssic, suicidal depressions, really rapidly. And I don't mean like a bipolar person where it takes some sort of there are periods of that. Although I sort of have a weaker and slower ebb and flow like that as well. But I mean over the course of an hour or 10 or 20 minutes. In fact, it can be instantaneous. If something something like triggers me in a negative way, especially, like I can get an intense flood of emotion that will completely destroy my ability to like basically do anything for like maybe the whole day and maybe even longer than that. So that's the other thing, is like things flood, like emotion will flood in rapidly, but then it takes a long time to clear back out too. So you can think about it in like almost like a hydrodynamic metaphor here. It is like flooding. It's like water floods in and then it lingers and it takes forever to drain. So it's like some terrible combination of like porous and then also not porous enough. It's like my ego is really wide open, such that tiny things can cause these huge intrusions from the unconscious. But then once that's happened, the ego like suddenly like locks down and like solidifies into this shape that then like holds that terrible stress max for much longer than it lasts for most people. And it sucks. It really does impact my life. This is an aspect of it that is absolutely like disordered, you know. So anyway, now having had all that huge spiel about normality and sanity and all of this, just to say, like, yeah, of course there are aspects of being a borderliner that are disordered and that are pathological and hurt me and hurt other people, and well, so that's one of them. This just sucks, and kind of like no matter what I do, this just affects me. I've developed really good like coping mechanisms, like strategies. I just kind of know how to ride it out. But yeah, I don't think I'm ever going to really be able to overcome this. This is some kind of a my belief is that this is like brain structural in some way, ultimately. So anyway, that's a very well-known characteristic of borderline, that it has this kind of emotional flooding aspect. I had thought for a long time that I couldn't really be borderline because I didn't have big emotional outbursts. And the way that I had seen this personality configuration represented typically involved that. It wasn't until I heard about quiet borderline that I understood, it can manifest in this other way. It can be internalized and internally directed more. This emotional flooding is part of it, but it's not the only thing that you get flooded with. Because it really just seems to be about a general problem with the conscious self-image and the ego complex, generally speaking. In borderline, it's like other kinds of unconscious contents can flood into consciousness. And so some of those are like weird archetypal contents. For me, it's like a lot of weird archetypal dreams, a lot of other kinds of liminal experiences, sleep paralysis and hallucinations in those sleep paralytic states, lucid dreams, out-of-body experiences, strange experiences that end up giving you also some strange beliefs about things. And so this now starts to get more complicated because outlier beliefs in things like ESP and clairvoyancy and precognition and so on are listed in the DSM as symptoms of schizophrenic and schizotypal personalities. But there's also a history in borderline of, first of all, of conflation with schizophrenia. Borderline and schizophrenia were kind of pooled together a bit, I think, initially. Now, this part isn't so well understood clinically, I think. And it's probably underreported, actually, because I think people with borderline aren't trying to add any more stigma to themselves, typically. And so, because we're very capable of identifying these parts as being sort of stereotypically crazy parts, we tend to minimize or just not express them. I think this has to do with the sort of the weakness of the ego personality still. Other sorts of unconscious thought processes can bubble into consciousness easily, including these ones that are drawing weird, somewhat schizoid connections between distantly related things. I think that process of psychotic style ideation is going on constantly in the unconscious of all human beings. It's out of that stuff that the more concretized, linear kinds of thinking emerge finally, I think. It's just that for some of us, our conscious awareness can become attuned to that process. And so, in general, the feeling I have in my head is that my conscious experience is kind of being bounced around this big chamber pretty rapidly. And it's kind of like a big multi-dimensional elevator shooting off in a bunch of different directions simultaneously always. And so that's happening to me like emotionally, but it's happening to me also in terms of the kinds of thoughts I'm having. I can shift from having very like mundane thoughts to very blown out like religious sorts of thoughts to very like pointed technical kinds of insights and stuff like very quickly. Such that it can be, it kind of makes me almost like a little vomitous in a way. Like it's there's like a constant kind of like rubber banding inertia to the way that my mind works. I'm bouncing around these opposites all the time in a way. Well, so then the other thing about how borderline works is that there's a kind of a dysregulation in the global self-image. In the Jungian terminology, we talk about this as being like the small s self, as opposed to the capital S self, which is really like the total human, which is a transcendental concept we don't have access to in ego consciousness. You don't know about yourself in totality. You only know about the parts of yourself about which you're conscious, which is a smaller set. But we have this idea in the Jungian tradition of multiple sort of scales of this thing. The self is a big regulating complex. It's a complex that's kind of managing relations between all the other complexes in the psyche. So it's really critical for the overall functionality of the personality. And there's this big transcendental self that's the same in all people. But then there's also kind of a more personalized self that is your unique personality sort of factored through time. It's the part of you that's planning for the future and that also remembers the past and knows that you're not just who you are today, you're also who you were and who you're going to be tomorrow. That's not quite at this level of like the universal basic self as this kind of abstract mathematical organizer of the psyche. This is more of a living God. It's like the indwelling immanent God. That thing is like frozen or dead or crippled in borderline. It's not regulating the complexes correctly. And so the complexes are often very autonomous and very charged and animated. But see, I think that the weakness of the ego and the weakness of the personal self are quite related, of course, because these two things exist in a tight relation. Similar dysfunctions and similar wounds in the personal history would affect the sort of the personal self-image and the actual personal ego. But so because of that, there's this sort of this combined effect then of there are these other complexes I have. If most people are like this, I'm kind of like this. You know? I've got sort of a number of sub-personalities that are all competing for control of my life. And they're competing because they're not really getting along because of the problem of this personal self not doing its job of managing these complexes, you see. This is actually a huge achievement for me because initially it was like this, you know, at least now, they're all kind of clustered together, and there are some zones where they all intersect even, so that's pretty good. But this kind of nearly perfect circle that a lot of people have, I just do not have, and will never have. It's not like in a true like multiple personality sort of situation. It's not that pronounced, but it's on that spectrum. I mean, even just at the level of like my identity as a musician, and then my identity as like a philosopher and a scientist. Those are almost like they're like two somewhat different people. And it's not just a shift of attention or interest. My whole sense of myself changes in a deep way when I'm doing the one versus when I'm doing the other. And I feel them as if they're big external forces in my life. They just kind of come in and pull me, and I'm helpless, So like I'd been working on my singing, and just every day training scales, learning songs, writing songs, doing all that kind of stuff. And I was kind of happy with that. And then, like out of nowhere, I just felt the gravity turn. I got pulled back to the question of synchronicity and the red twins. And then that opened this whole new can of worms to do with getting rigorous about modeling it all statistically. And it was painful. That was like a painfully abrupt and heavy transition. I just felt my artistic self die and this other self be born, and they're basically the same. I mean, it's another me, but that's just it. It's another me. It's another somewhat different me. So whereas other people have a kind of a more fluid movement, sort of smooth, slow, and fluid transition between these different states, these different sort of sub-states of their personalities, which all people have, of course. People are multidimensional. They're nuanced. They have different modes of being that come out at different times in different contexts. But whereas for neurotypical people, they're sort of fluidly, smoothly connecting. For me, it's this kind of like disjoint process often. There's this kind of like angular phasing of these somewhat discrete, much more discrete modes. And then also just kind of like total alien, like freak out modes where it's smooth, but it's way too fast, That's more like my personality. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit more deeply about what borderline personality is all about. And then following that, to connect it finally into this topic of synchronicity. And so in order to do that, I want to begin by reading some passages from this book, which is called The Borderline Personality, Vision and Healing. It was written by Nathan Schwartz-Salant, who is a Jungian analyst who did a lot of work with borderlines in the 1980s. This is the only book I've found to really sound the depths on borderline as a personality configuration that involves a heavy degree of kind of outlier spiritual ideation. And it was the book that showed me that I was borderline. I don't know if I could have received this diagnosis, really, outside of the Jungian context. If you get online today with the aim of reading about borderline personality, you will encounter a variety of definitions and approaches. First of all, there's an emerging distinction between classical borderline and so-called quiet borderline. Because quiet borderline is an emerging idea, and because it is not present in the DSM even, there's a lot of controversy about exactly what this means and exactly how it relates to classical borderline. The kind of external image of the classical borderline is of a very emotionally unstable person who is having very visible sort of outward meltdowns and other forms of acting out, who's probably also very manipulative. Borderlines are often misdiagnosed as narcissists because, well, for a variety of reasons, but one of which is because our behavior can sometimes seem narcissistic. In fact, the internal motivations are quite a bit different than a proper narcissist, but the external manifestation can be similar. This all leads to a lot of interpersonal problems for borderlines, especially in interpersonal relationships of the more intimate variety, not just romantic and sexual partners, although certainly there, but also just in terms of close friendships. And I would say even in things like working, social environments and stuff like that, it can be difficult to hold down a job when tiny things are triggering you to have big emotional outbursts. That's the kind of thing that might get you fired or at least not aggressively promoted, so on, in a corporate structure. Quiet borderline just means, as far as I can understand this anyway, it seems to just mean the same exact thing, except instead of directing this stuff outwards in a way that's visible, quiets direct this kind of stuff back inside. It's internally directed. So I'm not going to have a big emotional outburst at another person, so typically, if I'm a quiet borderline. I'm going to have those emotional outbursts in private, and I'm going to, there's variance here, but potentially I'm not going to really aggressively split on other people so much, in the sense of radically idealizing them and then subsequently radically devaluing them, and maybe that oscillates up and down a lot. I certainly do that with other people. I especially do this with groups. But as someone who identifies a little bit more on the quiet side of this binary, it's just more often the case that I'm really splitting on myself. I'm radically idealizing and then devaluing my own personhood. And so internally, these two things are really quite the same. They have all the same internal features. Splitting, which is that radical devaluing and idealizing. It's also sometimes talked about in terms of being about black and white thinking. Maybe not just purely idealization and devaluation, but just other forms of extremely polarized thought where moment to moment you are taking an extreme identification with a particular point of view to the exclusion of all other point of views, and then that changes. And then you're over on the other, perhaps opposite point of view, and just as intensely identifying with that. So splitting is one of the central characteristics. I'm just listing some main characteristics of borderline here ahead of digging into this book a little bit, so we all have a good orientation. So splitting, black and white thinking, a poor self-image, not necessarily in the sense of a negative self-image, because like I said, this often accompanies the splitting. You can have a very high self-image and then a very low self-image. But the point is that your self-image is distorted. And often you just kind of have a feeling of not really knowing exactly who you are, or feeling like you're very many things that don't quite add up to a coherent sense of self. Distorted self-image is one of the things that constitutes both classical and quiet borderline. A deep fear of abandonment. I'm not going to bother writing this. I'm actually that lazy, but a fear of abandonment is another one that unites these. The difference between classical and quiet is really just about how that's dealt with. In classical borderline, that fear of abandonment can be intensely projected outwards and can cause one to take very drastic action in social situations and things like that, whereas in quiet borderline, this is stuff that's more just kind of repressed and shunted down and dealt with in private. Of course, that doesn't preclude it sometimes bubbling over in a way that affects other people. And so we could add this fourth thing, which is the emotional flooding. We'll say there's these four key aspects of what it means to be a borderline. The missing thing here that you're not going to encounter in most of the mainstream conversations about either classical or quiet is this connection to what Salant calls the Numinosum. This is where I think synchronicity starts to come into play. This is kind of Salant's umbrella term for archetypal spiritual experience, let's say, of the sort that manifests often in borderline, and we'll read him a bit about that. This relates to what I was talking about with those weak ego boundaries. It's not just emotions and things that can flood the ego, but also these strong archetypal contents. This word numinosum derives from the word numinous or numinosity, which was coined or at least popularized by a guy named Rudolf Otto in a book called The Idea of the Holy. And then Jung adopts that and runs with it and uses it to define the experiential aspect of encountering archetypal forces in the psyche or in the world. And this stuff can penetrate the borderline's ego awareness with a rapidity, an extremity, and a fluidity that is unmatched in typical egos. It's actually one of the things that makes us very good artists, typically. And borderlines are quite overrepresented in the creative arts for this and other reasons. So, okay, that's our quick little map of just what is a borderline experience all about. And now I want to crack open this book a little bit. This book is actually available online. You can borrow it from archive.org. And this is a very nice scan of it. I was struck by this review here, which says, "There is much to be gained in reading this wonderful book. Schwartz-Salant gets to the depth of the borderline patient's experience to understand the core issues that wage war on them and everyone they come into contact with. This book's depth is relentless. Every page a treasure, and through Salant's compassion and understanding, one finds a level of compassion for one's own self, while being awakened out of their own state of previous blindness." This was really my experience with this book as well. One quick thing here, everyone they come into contact with. This is indicative of the fact that this book is really written about classical borderline. Quiet borderline wasn't really an idea when this book was being written in the 1980s. Again, I think the distinction is a little bit funny because it's really kind of the same beneath the surface. It's more about how functional you are in a way and how much you're able to pass and rely on normalized personas to get along with the hive. But this thing, the book is relentless, every page a treasure. It was really, I could not get through a page of this book without weeping, because it's the first time really in my life that I've encountered such an accurate reflection of myself. And to see somebody understand it with such compassion, with such empathy, just that was an immensely healing thing, to say nothing of what I've gained by actually putting some of the wisdom and the insights in this book into practice in my life. Well, so anyway, I've gone through this book and highlighted most of this book. But I wanted to start by just kind of with the introduction here and reading through some of these areas that I've highlighted. So this is kind of a cliff notes or summary form of the introduction to this book. I think that reading from books is a bit of a kind of anti-format thing to do on YouTube, potentially. It's not very visual, but this is what we need to do to get our bearings on this concept, I think. So, story time, here we go. Most borderline patients live their lives in such a manner as to avoid the intense psychic pain of abandonment. To this end, they employ psychotic mechanisms such as defensive idealization, splitting, denial, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors of doing, or the opposite, inertia. These psychic mechanisms exist in lieu of a well-functioning self that is the basic organizer of psychic life. He goes on here to talk a bit about the Jungian idea of the self. We've talked about that a lot on this channel. I don't particularly want to open it up in great depth at the moment. So skipping that here. Obviously, the self cannot be dead or totally absent, but in the borderline personality, it appears to be. In its immanence, that is, its existence within space-time life of the ego, the ordering power of the self appears to be overwhelmed by power drives and compulsive states, the darker aspects of existence. The borderline person has split off and denied imaginal perceptions. The imagination becomes either unavailable or persecutory. Then, to explain that a bit, he offers an example from one of his patients. Quote, "I saw my mother as she was standing and thinking, but I also saw another kind of presence within her, a withdrawn person filled with hatred. Once I saw this, I realized how the mother I knew was like a machine acting out a part that she was totally disconnected from. I saw this, and I was frightened, because I knew I wasn't supposed to." Salant says, "The imaginal world of the child is a universe of vision. The child often relinquishes this expanded way of seeing, rather than accept the awareness of how he or she is hated for any individuation efforts." So, right away, of course, Salant is as a good Jungian, tying this condition into a disordering of the self. Particularly, he talks about the immanent self, the self that manifests in the linear space-time experience of the ego. Elsewhere in the book, he talks about the propensity for borderline personalities to have an intuitive and innate connection to the transcendental self. But it's this personal self that is disordered and failing to unify the complexes into a coherent personality. At the same time, he's talking about the fact that borderlines have a powerful, although often very dysfunctional, gift for the perception, the accurate perception of unconscious process, both in themselves and in other people. I think this is actually one of the reasons why borderlines are so disliked by therapists often, is borderlines are very capable of peering into the internal worlds of other people. And therapists are generally not used to being on that side of the chair. And they don't like it if you see something accurate that is hidden and not meant to be seen. And borderlines are very good at doing that, partly, I think, because of a defense. We needed to be good at that growing up in order to deal with certain kinds of abuse that are very common in our backstories. Those histories mean that we became hyper-vigilant to subtle unconscious cues that we may have had to use to predict when a parent was going to go through an angular personality transition that resulted in some kind of physical or emotional abuse, or in some other kind of situation where it was very important to pay attention to subtle information to do with other people's interior states so that you could avoid experiencing abusive effects that eventually come to the surface. If you can catch that early, when it's a little unconscious tell, you can be in a better position to deal with the subsequent explosion. I also believe that it probably has to do with something innate, though. Again, going back to this idea of the weakly defined ego boundary. That sort of porous ego complex allows for intuitive understandings of other people's unconscious processes. So here's some external person who might be outwardly saying, "I'm happy," but internally they might be experiencing something very different. I think all human beings are capable of detecting the subtle shifts in body language, tone of voice, selection of topics over the course of a conversation, just all the kinds of stuff that might signal an unconscious process going on. It's just that generally that stuff remains unconscious unless it tips over a specific threshold. And for borderlines, that threshold is just very low. It's so low that we also, I think, perceive very many false positives. We'll think something is going on internally that isn't really there because it's just a kind of a problem of like mega amplified gain, you know? Like if you think about it in terms of a circuit, the gain is turned way, way up. We're amplifying all of these subtle unconscious tells. That can be accurate, but it can also be inaccurate. And later in the book, Salant explores those difficulties at some length. So let's continue. Borderline conditions exist within a spatial or interactional field whose unique qualities can easily be overlooked. This field bears similarities to the notion of liminality. We might describe the borderline person as being suspended in a liminal transition, a condition Turner describes as liminoid. Turner's just an author that Salant is working with in this portion of the book. The renewing qualities of the liminal ritual derive from the fact that they have an archetypal source. But in borderline conditions, archetypal qualities of renewal combine with personally acquired psychic structures in a most confusing way. This fusion occurs because the patient's ego oscillates between different parts of his or her psyche. 1. Split-off complexes of extremely negative affect. 2. Introjects of unconscious parental qualities. And 3. Feelings of absence related to failures in passage from one developmental stage to the next. This oscillation creates a situation in which feelings of omnipotence alternate with intense feelings of inferiority. That's that splitting in the self-image that I was talking about. The borderline personality involves states of mind that move within or around a border between personal and archetypal, so that aspects of each are interwoven in an often bewildering way. The borderline person's psyche induces entry into domains not easily recognized and usually shunned. And then to unpack that idea a little bit of these shunned domains, Salant talks a bit about Egyptian mythology here. He brings up Osiris and says that Osiris is, quote, a dead god. That is, he is not a god of the dead. He lies helpless and inert in the underworld, awaiting redemption. Osiris seems protected in his masochistic retreat. He lies motionless in the coils of a serpent who attacks him when he dares arise. This image reflects the experience of the borderline patient, whose very being is attacked for any individuation efforts. The borderline person's suffering can be understood in terms of archetypal processes that have been fragmented. The patient will experience the dark, disordering aspects of the conjunctio to the exclusion of its ordering and life-giving qualities. The conjunctio being an idea from the alchemical literature, to do with the union of the conscious and the unconscious, and the passage of material from the unconscious into the conscious. So he says, in using the term borderline throughout this work, I gratefully accept previous psychoanalytic contributions and draw from their models. But the symbolic understanding of the term borderline is also indispensable. This approach extends into regions that can never be fully grasped by rational means. Consequently, in this work, the borderline concept should be understood as a hybrid of symbolic and rational discursive approaches. Okay, so a little bit about all of that. Salant is saying that a major aspect of the borderline experience that isn't often commented upon is the fact that we are suspended in a liminal transition. Now, this idea of liminality is connected to the idea of the sacrificial rite, and in general with ideas like Joseph Campbell's monomyth, where a person exists within a space of sanctioned order and understanding, leaves that space, crossing through some kind of a transition into a chaotic world that is disordered and unsanctioned, recovers fragments of forgotten or potential order, pulls those together into some form and then reintroduces them across that threshold back into the world of order. Now, that world of order can be the society, in the sense of the nation or the tribe or the village. You might have to leave the domain of the known to learn something important that might help your tribe grow or thrive or respond to a crisis. But it can also all be very self-reflexive, in the sense that you need to leave the areas of your identity or of your psyche that are safe and comfortable to you, enter the domains of your mind that are chaotic and threatening, and often unconscious, and then from the unconscious, recover the keys of healing or something that you can then bring back to your ego awareness. So that's an archetypal process that is ongoing in all lives at all scales. But in the borderline person, there's a problem. The problem is of being trapped on this transition, and also of a seeming inability to actually capitalize on these potential sources of healing and renewal that exist in the unconscious. And so, for that reason, Salant is saying, look, this term borderline is actually more apt than we might have thought. Because actually the origin of that term has to do with a border between neurosis and psychosis. It was kind of thought borderline seems to combine features of both, and so it's at this borderline between these two forms of mental illness. Salant is saying, yes, that makes sense, sort of, although he does make an argument in the book that borderline probably will be understood someday as it's really its own unique configuration that transcends either of these ideas to do with neurosis and psychosis. But that the term has this other very helpful meaning to do with the border between essentially the world of the living and the world of the dead, and this ritual process of crossing over the liminal transition in order to perform this rite of archetypal renewal. That borderlines kind of get stuck on that edge. That's very bad often for the borderline. It can be very good for other people if the borderline can learn how to use that condition positively. Salant talks about this elsewhere as well, that borderlines often become a link to the Numinosum for others. Because they're standing, we're right there on that edge. It doesn't take much for us to peer into that forbidden space, recover things, insights, and so on, that when given to other people can make great use of. It's just that we find it difficult to make use of it ourselves. That's why Osiris is such an apt image. He's inert, impotent, and anytime he tries to rise a little bit, he's immediately cast back. He's also, of course, dismembered, cut up into many parts, which obviously relates to the borderline personality and identity distortion and just sort of irregularities in the internal relationships of the complexes. He gets into that a bit here, and now talking more about the Numinosum as well. Archetypal contents are characterized by a quality that Jung, following Rudolf Otto, called numinous. The Numinosum, in both its positive and negative forms, poses exceptional difficulties for the borderline patient. It is the root of all religious experience, and is characterized by both sublime and demonic qualities, referring to a dynamic that is beyond conscious control of the will. So he's saying part of this notion of an archetypal force is that it's properly transcendental relative to the will of the ego complex. He says here, the Numinosum seizes one. The function of religious systems is to separate humankind from the Numinosum, whose energies are often considered too dangerous to endure. So this is an interesting view of religion. That religion is like a coat or an insulator that protects people against too direct and overwhelming an experience of the Numinosum, of the archetypal domain of the unconscious. The borderline person is beset by fear of the Numinosum and is exceedingly vulnerable to its overwhelming power. Now Salant introduces something of critical importance, which is the relationship to the mother, both personal and archetypal. He says, when Freud referred to the oceanic experience, he was using that term to reflect upon very early mother-infant fusion states. The borderline person suffers from an absence of the nurture and support of this ocean. But he or she has often known a mystical realm, wherein the ocean is not the personal mother, but the Numinosum. In the borderline person especially, the Numinosum combines with the mundane. This is very important for our eventual understanding of how synchronicity relates to all this. I'll say it again. The Numinosum combines with the mundane. That is, it's interleaved with everyday experience in our psychology. It's not something that just happens in a special designated space, like a church or a temple, or in the context of a dream or a vision. It's something that can, and does routinely, pour into the minutiae of everyday life. The borderline patient is enmeshed in psychic levels of extreme intensity that bear intimate relation to many of the great archetypal themes in history. Battles between God and the devil, and life and death, the soul's rebirth, and especially the great drama of union that finds expression in the archetype of the conjunctio. Now, I can tell you from my experience as a borderline, this is just tremendously true. And it's something that baffled me, really, for my entire life. Like, why don't other people see these connections? For me, if I'm interacting with the system, like, say, it can be a minor annoyance, really. Here's a great example, actually. Every day I ride the bus to and from work. You know, the bus has an area that consists of these pneumatically operated double doors. And for safety reasons, they do not want people standing directly in front of these doors while the bus is in motion. These doors are kind of a fragile point. The thought is someone might fall into one and maybe sort of push them open or injure the pneumatic mechanisms that cause them to open, or etc. And so what they've done is they've installed this little sensor, which is probably some kind of a light-based sensor. It's probably shooting like a high-intensity laser-style beam out of one end and just detecting if that beam reaches some kind of photovoltaic cell on the other side. And so if there's an object in between, it breaks the path of that light. And then it detects, someone's standing where they shouldn't be. And it automatically triggers a loudspeaker that's in the bus. This is such an insane system, really. To play back a little recording that says, please stand away from the doors. And it says it just like that in this sort of robotically firm tone. And it will just repeat that, actually, infinitely. Now, okay, that might seem like a reasonable idea, except for the fact that at least in New York City following the pandemic, the MTA, which is the company that runs these buses, and I'm calling them a company because their structure is incredibly corporate. You know, they're meant to be like a state organization, but they're not running enough buses to cope with the amount of traffic. And so I can't remember the last time I was on a bus that resembled anything other than this. Just people packed like sardines in every single freely available space on the bus, including, of course, the areas where the doors are. And so there's no possibility of these people moving away from the doors. And so in addition to dealing with this very stressful and uncomfortable situation, where everybody is sharing air in a time in which people still have ambient anxieties about catching COVID and other things like that, and anyway, just kind of like physically uncomfortable situation of being like close to all these other people in this big moving metal chamber, we're now additionally like psychologically torturing the people on the bus with this voice that's very loudly saying, please move away from the doors, please move away from the doors, please move away from the doors. And this ignites my borderline reactions like intensely, because to me this very rapidly becomes, okay, it's not just some annoying thing. It's like a thing that hooks into like bad design, like capital B, you know, which is a problem that I think inflicts like huge amounts of suffering onto so many people all around the world every day in a billion, bajillion undocumented ways. And so that makes me think about, the controllers of society and the systems and policies and so on that they implement supposedly for the safety of the people they're meant to regulate, but that actually end up making those people's lives even more miserable, often due to a total lack of just intelligent foresight on the part of the people designing these things. Because if they were to think this through even a little bit, they would realize that buses are not operating in optimal conditions all the time, and so the whole design of this thing makes no sense. And then that big problem, which is then this big sort of social problem, becomes an archetypal problem, because then it becomes about the problem of what's seen and what isn't seen, and invisible suffering. And, well, invisible suffering, like, that's the story of my life in a way, and the story of many borderlines' lives. And as my thoughts are zooming out in that way, my affect about it is zooming out in that way. And so by the time I get off this bus, it's like ruined my entire day, I can't just bounce back from that. I'm now enmeshed in this dialectic between tyranny and liberation or something, which is quite intense, and much more intense than is probably warranted, strictly speaking, by this objectively kind of minor annoyance to do with a badly designed system in a bus door. So that's just one example. My brain is flying off in that way all the time, and it's just like other people don't seem to be having these extreme reactions. If you explain it to them, they'll say, oh yeah, sure, that's stupid, and that's a problem, and yeah, that is annoying. But they don't feel it with like a biblical depth or something, the way that I do. And so anyway, that's just a little bit of a sort of real life contribution to this dynamic that Salant is describing here in relatively abstract terms. Let's see here. This is all very important. I think I'm going to keep reading up until I get to the first big synchronicity tell, and then a little bit beyond that, and then we'll put Salant down and look at this other text I want to observe today. At especially difficult times during treatment, the therapist may dread the arrival of a borderline patient and experience anticipatory anxieties or become somewhat phobic towards the patient. In a strange way, the patient carries truth for the therapist, but it is a truth that lives in a destructive form. There is an Egyptian myth, he's really into the Egyptian myths, about the eye goddess, a symbol of the great mother archetype in the initial stages of creation, who roamed the world and destroyed everything it saw. We can say that the eye represents imaginal sight in its destructive form and is analogous to the borderline patient's truth. This sight is split off and unconscious in the borderline patient. The sense of being scanned by the patient's unconscious sight is a common experience. Unconscious sight plays the fierce role of protector of a severely wounded soul that has been nearly defeated by a lifelong trauma of hatred and lies. Yet this soul possesses the central, most important meaning and treasure in the person's life. This sight, when engaged, will alert the subject to a life and death battle between truth and falsehood. This is like what I was talking about with the stupid bus doors, There is such a battle between truth and falsehood sitting behind those occurrences. And this sight will perceive it. It will also intensely amplify it, which is part of our problem. So he says, one major task is to discover, contain, and transform this imaginal sight. Basically, to reintegrate it into consciousness, to calibrate it a bit better, and then to use it for the purpose of healing rather than for the purpose of destruction, which I would say has been the emergent focus for me in this entire project. Sync Century, this YouTube channel, all of the art I've made to do with synchronicity, etc., especially the automatic drawing and so on. It has been an attempt, and I think a pretty successful attempt, to recover and repurpose that imaginal sight for my benefit and the benefit of others. Because when it's oriented correctly, it can be quite powerful and quite good. So this is one of those paragraphs that I have basically the entire paragraph highlighted. This one's really a doozy. He says, the borderline patient has suppressed the ability to see emotional truth far more than most people. for in the early formative years, this kind of sight was perceived by him or her to be extremely dangerous. Commonly, the patient unconsciously colluded with the parent in order not to see that parent's hatred and psychotic qualities. The tacit agreement to act as if everything were normal created an inner fifth column, a dark shadow of hatred and rage, fused with the requirement to be blind to both one's own destructive qualities and those of others. Hence, the therapist's failure to engage the kind of imaginal vision that sees what others would prefer to remain unseen, often including the therapist's own errors, becomes a reenactment of the patient's history of betraying his or her own sight. The story that often unfolds is the sad one of the therapist's flight through ingenious deceptions from the patient's conscious and unconscious wrath. Whew, I identify with that so much. I think it's probably for another video to talk about my own particular trauma history and so on. I don't really want to bog down this video with that. It's already going to be a very long one, I think. And also, I don't feel particularly emotionally prepared to open that all up at the moment. But yeah, this notion of unconsciously colluding with the parent to repress and make invisible unfortunate emotional realities, and then the result of that emerging in these like reenactments throughout the course of life in therapy, and I would also say in various interpersonal relationships and so on. This sense of falseness, it's like kryptonite to a borderline. It makes me split on people right away if I detect even a bit of inauthenticity. It just ignites all of those old wounds for me, which is horrible, of course. It's an unrealistic expectation to have of people. People will be disingenuous sometimes. So will I. It's part of human nature. It's just that that particular part of human nature cuts me in multiple wounds that never really healed. And so one has this. One has the inner fifth column of hatred and rage fused with the requirement to be blind to those destructive qualities and to one's own suffering and the sufferings of others. Okay, so now we approach this opening up of the question of synchronicity. Salant is describing an experience he had with a patient. He says, I asked her if she had a sense of being able to see into other people. Oh, sure, she answered, all the time. And in a very guarded way, she told me that she was psychic. I asked her if she used this power for herself, that is, if she could believe what she saw and trust that what she perceived in this way had some truth to it. Her response was, quote, I only use it for other people, but I don't trust it for myself. Sometimes I get overtaken by it. I thought of a number the other day, 114, and I knew it had a special meaning. Then I saw it was the number of a restaurant. I went inside and saw a man with a girl. I became obsessed with finding out who he was. You'd be amazed at how I tracked him down. Finally, I found him. We had a brief affair, but, as usual with men, he tried to attack me physically. All the men I meet are like that. I can get overtaken by a psychic sense and become totally possessed by it. That's why I avoid it for myself. But for others, it works remarkably well. So, if you're someone who identifies as a synchead, I'm sure I don't need to point out how incredibly reflective this is of the way that we operate. A special number, 114, it's even, I have a special number which happens to be 113. So it hits very close to home, these sort of numbers beginning with 11. But in any case, a number just pops into this person's head. They know that it's a special number, a spiritual number of some kind, maybe a number that has to do with something in the future, and then, indeed, something happens in the future. They run into that number. It turns out it's the street address of a restaurant. where she has this powerful encounter with somebody. I've noticed this as well. Synchronicities tend to orbit around major life events like that. This idea that one can be, quote, overtaken by a psychic sense and become totally possessed by it. This book is such a treasure, really, because these things are not part of the standard conversations about borderline. I think this aspect of it is entirely missed, really. Partly because, as I said earlier, I think borderlines just don't talk about this stuff because we think it's going to make us seem even nuttier than we already seem to people. And partly because therapists don't know how to access this. They don't know how to ask it, and they wouldn't know what to do with the information if it was revealed, you know. Okay, last thing in here, and after that I will just say, if this all sounds like it's describing aspects of your life, please obtain and read this book. It's like an injection of self-awareness directly into consciousness. If you need that kind of injection, this is it. So this next part is about this labeled borderline affects and Jung's answer to Job. So he says, the archetypal energy storms that so afflict borderline individuals, and through them others, have traditionally been represented by myth and religion as the negative side of God. Jung's answer to Job is a mine of information about the overwhelming affects suffered by the borderline patient. Jung's reflections upon the psychological significance of Yahweh, his affects and behavior, are a veritable description of what is known today as the borderline personality. The Book of Job, and by the way, if you haven't read the Book of Job, it's really one of Jung's best. It's relatively short. It's a very cool procedure from the standpoint of like mythology remix or something, because he takes this Bible story and gives it really a completely different spin, almost an inverted spin of what sort of the classical understanding of that story is. And if you're borderline, Salant is very correct in saying you will identify with with it profoundly. But so the Book of Job shows the patriarchal God image in its most negative form. The phenomenon of Yahweh in this late Old Testament entry was particularly gripping for Jung, and his answer to Job was the only work that he found truly satisfying as an outpouring of his soul's wisdom. That makes me wonder a bit about Jung. I've read things over the years that indicate that perhaps Jung had a deeper sort of personality problem than is generally understood. There are aspects of his story that inch a little bit in the direction of DID, dissociative identity disorder, but definitely that inch in the direction of a borderline disorder as well. And so perhaps there's a reason that Jung was so interested in the Book of Job. Salant says, while there is little explicitly about clinical practice in this study, Answer to Job has a good deal to say about psychotherapy with the borderline patient, who lives in a psyche that can, at any time, be devastated by what feels like a natural catastrophe. These Yahweh-like affects can be far beyond conscious control. Healing can only begin when this terrifying phenomenon is somehow tamed. The borderline patient is ravished by Yahweh-like affects, but also fails to learn from the experience. These affects devastate the person's soul and force it to live on the brink of the nothingness and within a fog of constant despair. What is often surprising about the borderline patient is that no matter how ruthless the person may be, he or she can often value unimaginal awareness. In Jung's analysis, the spacious attitude that Job represents makes him a precursor of Christ. Job's unconscious has seen Yahweh's dual nature. The scapegoat shadow quality of a patriarchal God image is, I must have done something wrong. Otherwise, how could my plight be so bad? For Jung, Job's moral victory over the immoral affect fields represented by Yahweh is the decisive transformation factor leading to the psychological incarnation of acquiring an inner self-structure. The value of Job's regained conscious imaginal vision is not recognized. So here Salant is critiquing Jung a little bit and saying, okay, I see this, but there's another aspect to this story. It's the aspect of the ability to utilize imaginal sight, period. So he says, in contrast to Jung, Kathleen Rain's study of William Blake's Job illuminates Blake's emphasis on Job's active engagement of the imaginal world. He is released only when he sees God. This now prompts Salant to get into this portion to do with the Numinosum again. He says, many borderline patients have transcendent visions. These occur in the form of religious experiences, or an out-of-body or deathbed vision, or they can be experienced simply because of the propensity to experience the Numinosum, which results from a highly creative unconscious in combination with weak ego boundaries. Borderline patients often know as well the level of the transcendental self. What is not known is its immanence, for it has never incarnated. When the patient's own long-abandoned vision of the Numinosum can be regained, it often has the same kind of restorative effect as did Job's vision of Yahweh. We need to be aware that many people know this level and have split off from it. Our task, then, is to help the borderline patient regain conscious sight. That is, imaginal sight must be released from its compulsive activity of scanning other people, or, in the case of some borderline patients, aroused from its condition of absence and inertia. Okay. I wonder how much that last section made sense if you're not too familiar with the story of Job and with Answer to Job. But I'm going to have to leave that where it is for now. There was our sort of introduction to some deeper aspects of what it means to be borderline, and the first glimmer of a connection to what it means to be a synchead. That story about the psychic apprehension of the number that is then on the restaurant that precedes the complicated, dangerous romantic encounter, right? Now I want to look at another author. I want to look at somebody named August Strindberg, who was a Swedish playwright, novelist. Let's actually get the Wikipedia article open on him. There's August. I think you can tell he's someone who has seen some stuff. Also a poet, essayist, and painter. Wikipedia helpfully provides us with an image of the Mona Lisa to understand what a painter is. So I'm completely unfamiliar really with this guy's work. I was made aware of him via a YouTube lecture about the history of alchemy that included August as a kind of a modern alchemist. And that's because of this novel that he wrote called Inferno. I'll just read here from the Wikipedia. Inferno is an autobiographical novel written in French in 1896 to 97 at the height of Strindberg's troubles with both censors and women. That's a funny way to put it. I would say at the height of Strindberg's confrontation with the unconscious. The book is concerned with Strindberg's life both in and after he lived in Paris, and explores his various obsessions, including alchemy, occultism, and Swedenborgianism, and shows signs of paranoia and neuroticism. It does show that. It much more strongly shows signs of borderline personality, which I'll be arguing for here in a moment. Inferno has been cited as proof of Strindberg's own personal neuroses. Whoever's writing this doesn't really know what they're talking about. Normal neurotic is not the way I would describe Strindberg's psychology, at least as it manifests in Inferno. Although he definitely has a persecution complex. That's really a borderline thing. And also a schizoid thing. It also says here that Strindberg both invented and exaggerated much of the material in the book for a dramatic effect. I wonder what evidence they're talking about here. If anyone knows more about Strindberg's actual life as it is historically documented, I'd be interested to know about that kind of thing. But so in any case, I was watching this YouTube video about alchemy and the history of alchemy and its different periods and different alchemists that have lived, and it mentioned August, and I thought, well, that's interesting. Alchemist writing in the 1800s in this other kind of psychological, occulty context. You know, Swedenborg was a visionary who had views about the nature of the psyche and the soul that were not dissimilar to Jung and certainly not dissimilar to Blake. Swedenborg was big on the properly transcendental quality of the imagination and so on. And so it's very unsurprising that August would be interested in him. So I want to read some stuff from Inferno now. And I have here some quotes I've pulled out. It's pretty voluminous, but really, this to me is like extremely revealing, because this novel is an excellent example, I would say, of a borderline psychology, although that has not been recognized for some reason. It seems I can't find anyone talking about August Strindberg being potentially borderline. It certainly seems like a candidate to me. But it also is an incredibly like synchead rooted novel. And so it makes just by its existence, kind of makes an argument for some fundamental unity existing between these three ideas. That is borderline personality, alchemy, and the experience of sync perception. And so I actually want to start by just reading straight through the introduction here. Or not the introduction, which is written by some other person, but the first chapter. The Hand of the Invisible. With a feeling of wild joy, I returned from the Northern Railway Station, where I had said goodbye to my wife. She was going to our child, who was ill in a distant place. The sacrifice of my heart was then fulfilled. Her last words, "When shall we meet again?" and my answer, "Soon," echoed in my ears, like falsehoods, which one is unwilling to confess. A foreboding said to me, "Never," and, as a matter of fact, these parting words, which were exchanged in November 1894, were our last, for to this present time, May 1897, I have not seen my dear wife again. As I entered the Café de la Régence, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation of all the French terms in this, it's not going to be pretty, I placed myself at the table where I used to sit with my wife, my beautiful jail-keeper, who watched my soul day and night, guessed my secret thoughts, marked the course of my ideas, and was jealous of my investigations into the unknown. My newly worn freedom gave me a feeling of expansion and elevation above the petty cares of life in the great capital. In this arena of intellectual warfare I had just gained a victory, which, although worthless in itself, signified a great deal to me. It was the fulfillment of a youthful dream, which all my countrymen had dreamed, but which had been realized by me alone, to have a play of one's own, performed in a Paris theatre. Now the theatre repelled me, as everything does when one has reached it, and science attracted me. Obliged to choose between love and knowledge, I had decided to strive for the highest knowledge, and as I myself sacrificed my love, I forgot the other innocent sacrifice to my ambition or my mission. Okay, just right away here, I want to say there are already little signs of borderline ideation going on here. It's subtle right now, but first of all, just the fact that he conceptualizes of his life as a prison and his wife as a jail keeper, monitoring his soul. This idea that there's a jealousy somehow, a slightly sort of paranoid idea probably, that his wife is jealous of his investigations into the unknown. This radical oscillation of like being identified with a dream of getting a play performed, and then as soon as that happens, having your identity shift radically into this other direction. Now he's going to be a scientist, you know? I was just describing my own kind of experience with things like that. You go in a trajectory that is correlated with a part of you, one of these sub-personalities. And then when that internal configuration shifts around, or when something happens in the environment that causes it to shift around, you become like this other person. And then he conceptualizes of it in these giant archetypal terms immediately. Obliged to choose between love and knowledge. Well, is it that? I mean, I guess it is for Strindberg. It's really more like a career and a relationship. But here those things become symbolic of a much deeper transcendental process between love and knowledge itself. That's that kind of conflation or intermingling of the archetypal and the personal, which Salant writes about. And then this kind of the perpetual making of oneself into a sacrificial lamb, into something like Job. I had decided to strive for the highest knowledge, and as I myself sacrificed to my love, I forgot the other innocent sacrifice to my ambition or my mission. So I'm just going to finish with this chapter because it's, you can see it's relatively short and it sets up the main picture here. After that, we'll bounce around a bit. As soon as I returned to my poor student's room in the Latin Quarter, I rummaged in my chest and drew out of their hiding place 6 saucepans of fine porcelain. I had bought them a long time ago, although they were too dear for my means. A pair of tongs and a packet of pure sulfur completed the apparatus of my laboratory. I kindled a smelting furnace in the fireplace, closed the door, and drew down the blinds. For only 3 months after the execution of Caserio, it was not prudent to make chemical experiments in Paris. So I don't know who that is. Maybe that's a historical chemist or alchemist of some kind. But again here, there's a looming paranoia at the outset that I'm doing secret work that the collective would kill or persecute me for if they knew that I was doing it, and for which I have sacrificed my relationship with my wife and child, additionally. This is very heavy stuff, The night comes on, the sulfur burns luridly, and towards morning I have ascertained the presence of carbon in what has been before considered an elementary substance. With this, I believe I have solved the great problem, upset the ruling chemical theories, and won the immortality grudged to mortals. You can start to see here the instability in the self-image and this radical idealization at the moment. The immortality, he's become immortal. He's solved the great problem. And what is the nature of that great problem? Well, it's an alchemical problem here. He thinks that he's shown that sulfur contains other parts, that it contains carbon, and later he's going to try to argue that it contains oxygen and something else as well. Of course, that's not true. Sulfur is an element. It's an element that can exist in configurations that are not so dissimilar to oxygen. And I think it can maybe bond with carbon or something. I don't really know my chemistry. But I'm interested in this as a kind of a psychological metaphor, of course, because what he's talking about in a more abstract sort of way is something that the collective considers to be a unity. And he's saying, no, it's actually built out of a bunch of hidden parts. And that's like the borderline identity, and really like the psyche in general. It's just that in the borderline situation, this aspect of what a psyche is kind of pushed to a kind of a relative extreme. We don't have exactly a unified holistic identity in the same way that the normals have one. What we have is indeed a sulfur that is built out of other components. It's about perceiving a discontinuity or a fracturing of parts in a thing that is commonly regarded to not be fractured into parts. And that is the great puzzle, the great secret that rewards him the immortality of the gods, i.e. that would allow him to individuate, potentially, if you could understand the alchemical process as a metaphor for the separation and reunification of the complexes. But the skin of my hands, nearly roasted by the strong fire, peels off in scales, and the pain they cause me when undressing shows me what a price I have paid for my victory. But as I lie alone in bed, I feel happy, and I am sorry I have no one whom I can thank for my deliverance from the marital fetters which have been broken without much ado. For in the course of years I have become an atheist, since the unknown powers have left the world to itself without giving a sign of themselves. Someone to thank! There is no one there, and my involuntary ingratitude depresses me. You see this quality already of these immensely contradicting feelings and attitudes. He's in pain, physical pain. Also, one would have to imagine in some level of emotional pain. He's split from his wife and daughter. He lies alone in bed, yet he says, I feel happy. And in the very next sentence he says, and I am sorry, which would indicate a kind of feeling sorry is not exactly feeling happy, no? It's something else. And I am sorry I have no one whom I can thank for my deliverance from the marital fetters, which there's some kind of a repression here of the loss, I think. I wish there was someone to thank that I no longer have to interact with my wife. Spoiler, a few chapters later, he's going to be longing for a reunion with his wife and writing a big love letter to her, and this oscillation happens many times throughout the course of this novel. He can't decide if he loves or hates his wife, wants to be with her or doesn't want to be with her. It's classical borderline instability in an interpersonal relationship here. But then also he says, I have no one to thank because there's no one here. I've become an atheist since the unknown powers have left the world. But that's a very strange way to describe oneself as being an atheist, because it's admitting the existence of unknown powers. It's just kind of saying they're not showing themselves. There is a God, but he's hiding himself from me. He's made my life godless. That is such a borderline style of thinking, I think. At the very least, it's a very Gnostic way of thinking, that this world is an alienated one, abandoned by a God who exists but does not reveal himself directly, and whose place has been taken by a kind of an evil or a nefarious God, or just a God of absence, as it were. Feeling jealous about my discovery, I take no steps to make it known. In my modesty, I turn neither to authorities nor to universities. While I continue my experiments, the cracked skin of my hands becomes worse, the fissures gape and become full of coal dust, blood oozes out, and the pains become so intolerable that I can undertake nothing more. I am inclined to attribute these pains, which drive me wild, to the unknown powers which have persecuted me for years and frustrate my endeavors. So again, what kind of an atheist is, this isn't really an atheist, right? This is someone who believes they're being persecuted by invisible transcendental forces. A very borderline way to think about things, but also I would say a very sinkhead way to think about things. He says, I avoid people, neglect society, refuse invitations, and make myself inaccessible to friends. I am surrounded by silence and loneliness. It is the solemn and terrible silence of the desert, in which I defiantly challenge the unknown in order to wrestle with him, body with body and soul with soul. I have proved that sulfur contains carbon. Now I intend to discover hydrogen and oxygen in it, for they must also be present. But my apparatus is insufficient. I need money. My hands are black and bleeding, black as misery, bleeding as my heart. For during this time, I continue to correspond with my wife. I tell her of my success in chemical experiments. She answers with news about the illness of our child, and here and there drops hints that my science is futile, and that it is foolish to waste money on it. In a fit of righteous pride, in the passionate desire to do myself an injury, I commit moral suicide by repudiating my wife and child in an unworthy, unpardonable letter. I give her to understand that I am involved in a new love affair. The blow goes home. My wife answers with a demand for separation. Solitary, guilty of suicide and assassination, I forget my crime under the weight of sorrow and care. No one visits me, and I can see no one, since I have alienated all. I drift alone over the surface of the sea. I have hoisted my anchor, but have no sail. Initially here, he makes it sound like a choice, right? I avoid people, neglect society, refuse invitations, make myself inaccessible. And certainly I'm sure there is an aspect of that. One willingly surrounds oneself with this kind of silence, this kind of loneliness, enters into the desert, in order to pursue the secret work, the alchemical work, which he's talking about here. This sense of sacrifice, that in order to do this, you have to become existentially lonely. There's truth in that, but I also think it's a way that we comfort ourselves when we find ourselves in that loneliness without exactly choosing it. And he alludes to this later, I think, when he says, "No one visits me, I can see no one, since I have alienated all." Probably alienated them with borderline affects, you know. The fact that he would write this letter with an invented pretend love affair just to hurt and alienate his wife, that's a kind of a manipulation, you know. All of these things signal borderline psychology to me, you know. And also, just speaking personally too, like, wow, the similarity of this to my story is intense. Because when I first started investigating alchemy and the unconscious and all of this business, it did come at a time of separation that gradually intensified, and eventually I left Seattle, where I had been living, and my girlfriend dumped me, and it was this whole kind of situation. And I, you know, this section here about the loneliness and the refusal of invitations and the working on something secret and unknown that's going to be really important someday, like at this insane cosmic level. But if only I had the money and the apparatus and the, you know, I can't even think about how many times I've said things like that on this very channel. You know, if only we had the machine intelligence and the this and the that to put on the problem of the red twins. I don't know what that all means or doesn't mean, but it's profound to notice the psychological similarity. This sort of problem is an alchemist's problem. But what does it mean, friends, to be an alchemist? I hope that we're gaining some clarity on that here. Necessity, however, in the shape of an unpaid bill, interrupts my scientific tasks and metaphysical speculations, and calls me back to earth. Christmas approaches. I have abruptly refused the invitation of a Scandinavian family, the atmosphere of which makes me uncomfortable because of their moral irregularities. I wonder what he's talking about there. But when evening comes and I am alone, I repent and go there all the same. They sit down to table, and the evening meal begins with a great deal of noise and outbursts of hilarity, for the young artists who are present feel themselves at home here. A certain familiarity of gestures and attitudes, a tone which is anything but domestic, repels and depresses me indescribably. In the middle of the orgy, my sadness calls up to my inner vision a picture of the peaceful home of my wife. The Christmas tree, the mistletoe, my little daughter, her deserted mother. Pangs of conscience seize me. I stand up, plead ill health as an excuse, and depart. I go down the dreadful Rue de la Gaieté, in which the artificial mirth of the crowd annoys me, then down the gloomy, silent Rue de l'Ambre, which is more conducive to despair than any other street of the quarter. I turn into the Boulevard Montparnasse, and I'm so sorry for the pronunciation, and let myself fall on a seat on the terrace of the Lillis Brewery. A glass of good absinthe comforts me for some minutes. Then there fall on me a set of coquettes and students who strike me on the face with switches. As though driven by furies, I leave my glass of absinthe standing and hasten to seek for another in the Café Francois Premier on the Boulevard Saint-Michel. Out of the frying pan into the fire, a second troop shouts at me, "There is the hermit!" Driven forth again, I fly home, accompanied by the unnerving tones of the Merleton pipes. The thought that it might be a chastisement, the result of a crime, does not occur to me. In my own mind I feel guiltless, and consider myself the object of an unjust persecution. The unknown powers have hindered me from continuing my great work. The hindrances must be broken through before I obtain the victor's crown. I have been wrong, and at the same time I am right, and will maintain it. That Christmas night I slept badly. A cold draught several times blew on my face, and from time to time the sound of a Jew's harp awoke me. Now the other stuff were like little flickers, but this just screams borderline experience to me. He's lonely, isolated, tries to rejoin some kind of a social thing, and is completely miserable. Everyone else's happiness feels false to him and intensifies his own bad mood, puts him further into his own experience, so he makes up an excuse and leaves, I do that all the time because I know exactly the sensation of being surrounded by normal people doing their normal happy things that you kind of don't even believe when you're in this mind space, you know? You kind of think they're just, oh, I don't know how to describe it, but it's awful, and so you try to eject yourself from it. And so then he decides to go get some substance to deal with that pain, and that's a very common story. Substance abuse is something that accompanies borderline, along with like risky sexual activity and various kind of pain-numbing things like that. And as he's wandering through the street, I mean, listen to this language. The dreadful rue in which the artificial mirth, there it is exactly. There's joy around me, but it's fake. I can't believe in it. And so it's dreadful and an annoyance. And then the gloomy, silent other rue, this other street, you know, which is more conducive to despair than any other street. I mean, this flooding of like, or this conflation between internal states and environmental states. What does he mean that there's a street that is conducive to despair? You know? I mean, normal people will pick up on vibes like that a little bit, but I think for borderlines, this can be very intense. And I've had things like this in my life. There are just certain spaces and environments that really modulate my internal emotionality. And it's also a bit of, where could this person even be happy? The street that's full of people and the celebratory atmosphere makes him miserable because it's false and he won't accept it. The gloomy street, where presumably there aren't a lot of people and maybe it's kind of shadowy and quiet or something, only amplifies his despair. So there's no environment that he can be comfortable in. And that's a very borderline kind of thing. You focus on the despair, it makes you miserable. You focus on the positives and you don't believe them. And so you're trapped in this kind of misery. Then he finds his way into a bar and he says, "There fall on me a set of coquettes and students who strike me on the face with switches." A coquette, I believe, it's literally some kind of a cooking device, but it's French slang for a prostitute. So prostitutes and students are striking him on the face with switches. I think he means like sticks. Then he runs away from that situation to some other bar where people shout at him, "There's the hermit," and drive him out of that location. He runs back home. Perhaps this is one of the regions that is exaggerated. It's hard for me to imagine how this possibly could be happening. Prostitutes and students hitting him on the face with sticks? How do they even have these sticks, you know? This is probably metaphorical to some degree, but it's a metaphor that really expresses, I would say, this sort of borderline feeling. This persecutory feeling of, I'm just trying to get along and I'm attacked, viciously attacked, and driven out of every social group context. It's just kind of putting into metaphor space a little bit the literal thing he was just discussing, right? Which was going to this social function and having it feel harmful, as if it kind of amplifies his internal discontent, and then running away from that. This is now like an even more intense restatement of that. And then finally he says, "The unknown powers have hindered me from continuing my great work." So it's not just some experience you've had either. It's like you draw it back to the influence of invisible forces, which is not inaccurate. It's at least the influence of invisible forces in the unconscious, driving you into these borderline states. Okay, so that's the first chapter of Inferno, The Hand of the Invisible. I now want to step through these quotes that I've pulled out. Okay, so this next portion is occurring in connection with the wounds that he suffered on his hands, right, as a result of his alchemical experiments. Someone, I think, from the dinner party is worried about him and so comes to check in on him and raises some money so that he can go to a hospital. And so he says here, "Once more a beggar, asking for alms by means of a woman, I begin to suspect that there is an invisible hand which guides the irresistible logic of events. I bow before the storm, determined to rise again at the first opportunity." So again, this is just this constant relating of events in one's life to an invisible transcendental structure of some kind. An invisible hand which guides the irresistible logic of events. That's pretty close to the way that I often define synchronicity itself. And I'm interested here also just in the use of that word storm, because we often talk about the idea of a sync storm in the community. It's something that does seem to kind of descend upon one from the outside, and so aligns itself very naturally with the attitude August is expressing here. Okay, so now this cuts to him being in the hospital and receiving treatment. He says, "They dress me and undress me, and look after me like a child. The kind sister takes a fancy to me, treats me like a baby, calls me my child, while I call her mother. But it does me good to be able to say this word mother, which has not passed my lips for 30 years. The old lady, an Augustan nun, who wears the garb of the dead because she has never lived, is mild as resignation itself, and teaches us to smile at our sufferings as though they were joys, for she knows the beneficial effects of pain. She does not utter a word of reproof, nor admonition, nor sermonizing." So he meets this nun, and it's a contact with a kind of a cultural mother figure. And he states here, that he's not said the word mother in 30-some years, but that it does him good to say it. It strongly indicates a complex to do with the mother, which, remember, is just what Salant and many other people, non-Jungians included, writing about borderline, have concluded that there does seem to be a persistent issue with this lack of a nurturing mother energy at certain critical stages of development in childhood. And so I find that eyebrow-raising there, if not exactly a smoking gun, per se. Then the nun puts him in touch with this apothecary, where he's able to borrow some books to continue his alchemical research. He says here, his theory of the composite character of so-called simple bodies, getting back to what we were talking about before, my hypothesis, this is a psychological metaphor. The composite character of so-called simple identities might be another way to put that. And so he says, the first book which I take out of the apothecary's library opens of itself, and my glance fastens like a falcon's on a line in the chapter headed Phosphorus. The author states briefly that the scientific chemist, Lockyer, has demonstrated by spectral analysis that phosphorus is not a simple body, and that his report of his experiments has been submitted to the Parisian Academy of Science, which has not been able to refute his proof. So I wanted to quote this just because this sort of procedure of coming into contact with a book somewhere, somehow, that then just kind of falls open quasi-randomly to some page, and then like a laser focus, your perception zeroes in on just some area that's really pertinent to something that you're working on. That's a thing that we commonly experience, I would say, as syncheads. I've had discussions with other syncheads about this sort of phenomena, and at least myself, I've had this happen so many times with films, but also literally with books, Sometimes I'll be walking to and from work or to and from some social function or something like that, just walking around New York City, and someone will have left a book out and it'll catch my eye, and I'll kind of randomly open it, and like the first page has some kind of paragraph that's insanely applicable to some situation I'm going through at that moment, or some major long-form obsession of mine, or etc. And I always notice it as a synchronicity. And so it's interesting that August notices this too. He takes time because he might not have told you about this, right? He might have just said, I borrowed this book and it had some stuff in it that helped me with my research. But instead he tells you about this strange numinous setup, that it's the first book and it just falls open onto a page that then has this exact piece of information that pertains to my work. Isn't that a coincidence? But the reason that he's telling you about it is he's offering it to you as proof of the workings of this invisible hand, the powers, as he refers to them, over and over again. In the Sync community, we refer to them as the Sync gods, sort of partly tongue-in-cheek, but we're talking about the same thing, fundamentally. He picks up on this again later. The happiness of feeling myself loved in spite of everything awakes in me the need of thankfulness. But to whom? To the unknown, who has remained hidden for so many years? The next morning I hasten to my chemist on the Boulevard Magenta and bring his analysis of my powder in a closed cover back to the hospital. So he's trying to get this analysis of sulfur and carbon and all of this to prove his theory. He says, when I came to the statue of St. Louis in the courtyard of the institution, I think of the Quinze-Vingt, the Sorbonne, and the Sainte-Chapelle, these three buildings founded by the saint, which I interpret to mean from suffering through knowledge to repentance. Okay, so the Quinze-Vingt was a hospital for the blind, I think. The Sorbonne is a university, and the Sainte-Chapelle is a church. And so he's saying, look, I interpret the hospital to symbolically mean suffering. I interpret the university to symbolically mean knowledge, and I interpret the church to symbolically mean repentance, and they go together to form a kind of a composite idea about a movement from suffering through knowledge to repentance. I have this here because this is a very synchead sort of thinking. To look at something like some physical buildings and say, okay, these aren't really just buildings, they're symbols, these like archetypal ideas, and they go together in a kind of a combined coincidence to make a kind of an esoteric statement about spiritual development or something. That's just the kind of thing that we would do and do. Scott Onstott is a synchead who has done a tremendous amount of work on the symbolic meaning of architectural spaces and sites like this. So it's just one of those things that sends off my kind of bell ringing of like, one of us. This guy is thinking along very, very similar lines. So he gets this analysis of the sulfur back, and it's favorable. And so he says, I am saved. From henceforth I can prove to my friends and relations... Oh, I forgot to turn on my other microphone. Let's do that now. Apologies for the momentary lapse in audio quality there. I am saved. Henceforth, I can prove to my friends and relations that I am no fool. I can establish the theories which I propounded a year ago in my Anti-Barbarus, a work which the reviews treated as that of a charlatan or madman, making my family consequently thrust me out as a good-for-nothing. My opponents are pulverized. My heart beats in righteous pride. I will leave the hospital, shout in the streets, bellow before the institute, pull down the Sorbonne. But my hands remain wrapped up, and when I stand outside in the courtyard, the high encircling walls counsel me. Patience. Sometime after that, he returns to this bar. He says, 6 weeks ago, I sat here at this table. My theater manager sat opposite me and called me Dear Sir. Journalists pestered me with their interviews. Photographers asked me for the honor of selling portraits of me. And today, who am I today? A beggar, a marked man, an outcast from society. You can see these radical oscillations taking place again. Just this whole story, really, of like, I had these theories that everyone thought were crazy, and it made my family totally reject me, but now I'm pulverizing my opponents, and my heart beats in righteous pride. He's like singing in the streets, and then just a short while later, he's back in this bar, remembering a time when people were interested in him, and now he's a beggar and an outcast. It's this, he's on top, he's on bottom, he's on top, he's on bottom, he's on top, he's on bottom. These are the mood swings of a borderline personality. Now we have, I think, a very telling section. Now that the existence of the invisible hand, which guides me over rough paths, has become a certainty to me, I no longer feel solitary, and keep a careful watch over my words and actions, although, it must be confessed, I am not always successful. But whenever I slip, I am at once arrested and punished with such punctuality and exactness that I have no doubts left regarding the interposition of a judicial power. The unknown has become for me a personal acquaintance with whom I speak, whom I think, whom I consult. Very often I compare him in my mind with the demon of Socrates, and the consciousness that the unknown powers are on my side lends me an energy and confidence which impel me to unwanted efforts of which I was formerly incapable. A bankrupt as regards society, I am born into another world where no one can follow me. Things which before seemed insignificant attract my attention. My nightly dreams assume the form of premonitions. I regard myself as a departed spirit, and my life proceeds in a new sphere. I mean, I almost could have written this at various points in my synchronicity journey. First of all, there's this tendency to assign both positive and negative happenings to the workings of these invisible powers. The ego's responsibility and the ego's action in producing these things is made invisible in this kind of thinking. It's not that I think this kind of this kind of thinking is wrong exactly. It's a perspective that, when you have it purely, is distortional, though, because it excludes the operations of earthly influences on these sorts of outcomes and eventualities, which are also clearly operative. It's an intermixture of the workings of divine process and the workings of human process, both of which, of course, sum to one giant process in which the divine is working through the human. That would be my view of it today. But especially this ending part. I am born into another world where no one can follow. Things that seemed insignificant now attract my attention. My dreams assume the form of premonitions, and I regard myself as a departed spirit. Yeah, this is like a sinkhead adolescence, as Joe Alexander has called it, or a sinkhead birth. Unmistakable. And so the fact that this paragraph, which so strongly signs in the direction of a sinkhead awakening, and this earlier material, which so strongly signifies in the direction of a borderline psychology, and that all of this is wrapped up in this interest in alchemy, to me, this text, Inferno, is a very powerful area where multiple stories that before I had regarded as somewhat separate start to merge together and show their kinship. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that these phenomena, synchronicity, borderline, and alchemy, although they are distinct, they're definitely not wholly separate. They tend to go together as frames on a single unified problem or process, which is the process of individuation, I would say, ultimately. The process of becoming who you were born to be, in a sense, or of discovering your authentic identity, which is a particular problem for borderlines, a problem for everyone, but really a problem for us. We can't see ourselves so clearly, and so we're very desperate for mirrors. Alchemy is such a mirror. It's no wonder that so many of us are attracted to it. Synchronicity is such a mirror. It's no wonder that so many of us are attracted to it. So, okay, I'm going to skip over this part. This is some more evidence of this persecutory mental style. You know, the hour has struck, and I run the gauntlet of the young students who regard my undertaking with scorn and prejudice. This is while he's using some equipment at a university. I mean, who knows? I wasn't there. I don't know what this is in reference to, but do we really think that these young students were even paying that much attention to him? This sounds to me more like a somewhat schizzed out paranoid complex that people are judging him so negatively for every little thing that he does. Doubtful. They're probably not paying too much attention to him to begin with. Okay, now this section. The summer and autumn of the year 1895 I count, on the whole, among the happiest stages of my eventual life. All my attempts succeed. Unknown friends bring me food as the ravens did to Elijah. Money flows in. I can buy books and scientific instruments, among them a microscope, which reveals to me the secrets of life. Dead to the world, as I have renounced the vain delights of Paris, I remain in my quarter, where every morning I visit the dead in the churchyard of Montparnasse, and thence descend to the Luxembourg garden to greet my flowers. Sometimes one of my fellow countrymen on his way through Paris visits me in order to invite me to breakfast on the other side of the river, and to go to the theater with him. I decline, because the right bank is forbidden to me. It is the so-called world, the world of the living, and of vanity. Although I cannot formulate it distinctly, a kind of religion has been forming in me. It is rather a condition of the soul than a view of things based on dogmatic instruction. A chaos of sensations which condense themselves more or less into thoughts. I have bought a Catholic prayer book and read it with a collected mind. The Old Testament comforts me and chastens me in a somewhat obscure fashion, while the New leaves me cold. This does not prevent a Buddhist book having a stronger influence on me than all other sacred books, because it ranks positive suffering above mere abstinence. Buddha shows the courage, when in full possession of vital energy and enjoyment of married happiness, to renounce wife and child, while Christ avoids every contact with the permitted joys of this world. So, a few things to say about this. First of all, this kind of syncretic reading of multiple religious books, that's something that we definitely do in the Sync community routinely. I'd say that's a major aspect of our spiritual style. We're not just going to read a Catholic book. We're going to read a Buddhist book and try to hold those together in a comparative way and triangulate what the psychological or deeper esoteric spiritual truth might be that's formed in the middle, as it were, of these different perspectives. Also, this feeling of radical separation, literally being separated from the world by a river that you forbid yourself to cross. I go through periods like this. I go through periods where I feel deeply connected to the world in that synchead kind of way, where there is almost no distinction between me and any other person, all other people, the voice of the earth itself. It's all one big continuous story. But then, that's when there's essentially a mania happening. But then I also get to experience the horrible, depressive fall of that into the feeling that I am radically disconnected from every other living being. And that I am essentially, like he says, living in the world of the dead, though I am alive. So I find this all extremely relatable. Okay, so now we start digging a little deeper into some of this sync stuff. At an earlier period, in the great crisis of my life, I had observed that I could exercise a telepathic influence on absent friends. In popular legends, writers have occupied themselves with the subjects of telepathy and witchcraft. I wish neither to do myself an injustice, nor altogether to acquit myself of wrongdoing, but I believe that my evil will was not so evil as the counterstroke which I received. So you can see there's a kind of a karmic mindset beginning to form here as well. Essentially that if you use magic for an untoward purpose, or just a shallow self-serving purpose, that the invisible synchronicity powers might send you back some kind of a punishment for that. It's a thought that myself and other synkheads I've talked to definitely entertain. It's a scary way to think, but it comes quite naturally when one begins to perceive this way. So he says, a devouring curiosity, an outbreak of perverted love, caused my frightful loneliness, inspired me with an intense longing to be reunited with my wife and child, both of whom I still loved. But how is this to be brought about, as divorce proceedings were already on foot? Some extraordinary event, a common misfortune, a thunderbolt, a conflagration, in brief, some catastrophe which unites two hearts, just as in novels two persons are reconciled at the sickbed of a third. Stop! There I have it, a sickbed. Children are always more or less ill. A mother's fear exaggerates the danger. A telegram follows, and all is said. So, I'm actually not sure exactly what he's talking about here, but he's performing some kind of a magical ritual with the image of his daughter in an attempt to will his daughter into illness so that can become the occasion upon which a reunification with his wife can be achieved. So he goes on to say there, I had no idea of practicing magic, but an unwholesome instinct suggested I must set to work with the picture of my dear little daughter, who later on was to be my only comfort in accursed existence. Further on in this work, I will relate the results of my maneuver, in which my evil purpose seemed to work with the help of symbolical operations. Meantime, the results had to be waited for, and I continued my work with a feeling of undefined uneasiness and a foreboding of fresh misfortune. So, in his view, this magical operation is successful. The daughter actually does fall ill eventually, and then he experiences intense guilt for having worked this procedure. I have had experiences like that as well. Not exactly so maliciously oriented, but I have done little magical procedures that then to me seem to manifest actual results that were kind of dangerous. There's a video on this YouTube channel you can find in which I discuss my experience of maybe summoning a fireball into existence that, while no one was injured, certainly could have injured somebody. And, well, that sounds nutso to you. I doubt it would have sounded nutso to August. Okay, moving along. Here, we start to see a projective sort of perception kick into functionality. One evening, as I sat alone before my microscope, an occurrence happened which made all the deeper impression on me because I did not understand it. For 4 days I had let a nut germinate, and now detached the germ. This had the shape of a heart, not much larger than the core of a pear. Standing between two cotyledons, it looked like a diminutive human brain. One may imagine my surprise when I saw on the glass slide of the microscope 2 tiny hands, white as alabaster, folded as if in prayer. Was it a vision? A hallucination? Oh no! It was a crushing reality, which made me shudder. The little hands were stretched out towards me, immovable, as if adjuring me. I could count the 5 fingers, the thumb shorter than the others. Real woman's or child's hands. I made a friend who surprised me watching this astonishing sight witness it also. He required to be no clairvoyant in order to see 2 clasped hands which besought the sympathy of the beholder. What was it? Nothing but the 2 first rudimentary leaves of a walnut tree, the Juglans regia, nothing else. Yet the fact was undeniable that 10 human fingers were clasped in a beseeching gesture, as if expressing de profundis clamaei ad te. I wonder what that means. But as a still too incredulous empiric, I passed by the occurrence, callously. So here we're talking about a very interesting sort of phenomena. It's not a hallucination or a vision, like he says. It's some actual object that, apparently, because his friend corroborates the correspondence, objectively correlates to an archetypal image. This first we have the idea of this brain, and then the idea of 2 hands folded in prayer. This is like a match. It's a kind of a visual synchronicity. There's one thing that's happened in some somewhat stochastic, quasi-random way that ends up producing a symbol of a spiritual, archetypal, or psychological process. This is his first brush with this, but then the floodgates seem to open. He even marks the location in the book. He says, "Now things begin to happen which cannot be explained without the cooperation of the unknown powers. From this point, I use the entries in my journal, which have gradually become very numerous, giving them in a condensed form. Every synchead I know has this kind of journal, some insane text document filled with these sorts of happenings. So, one morning I awoke with the idea of making a trip into the country, though it is quite against my tastes and my habits. When I, more by accident than design, reach the station of Montparnasse, I take the train for Meudon. I go into the village itself, which I visit for the first time, traverse the main street, and turn to the right into a narrow alley confined by walls on both sides. So he's in an unknown location, and in a way that's breaking his normal life pattern. 20 steps before me, I see, half buried in the ground, the figure of a Roman knight in gray iron armor. It looks very well modeled, but as I approach, I see that it is only rough metal smelting. But I hold my illusion fast, since it pleases me. The knight looks towards the wall, and following the direction of his gaze, I notice something written on the mortar with a piece of coal. It looks like the letters F and S interlaced, which are the initial of my wife's name. She loves me still. The next moment I see, as by a flash, that it is the chemical symbol for ferrum, iron, and sulfur. And the secret of gold lies revealed before my gaze. I search the ground and find 2 leaden seals fastened together by a string. One displays the initials VP, the other a king's crown. Without committing myself to further interpretation of this adventure, I return to Paris with the lively impression of having experienced something bordering on the marvelous. I think later in the book he picks up on this VP thing again, so this becomes like the beginning of a sync chain that gets developed. But wow, I do not know how to interpret this paragraph as anything other than a synchead experience, you know? He's in this new place, he sees this weird thing, it looks like a knight, he starts investigating the area for other, like, visual symbolism, finds something written with a piece of coal, maybe, that looks like the letters F and S. Those are initials for his wife, and so then he interprets that as a sign from the powers that his wife still loves him. It's a divination. It's just a coincidence. He's found this weird thing that coincidentally has his wife's initials. But that takes on a higher level of meaning. And then at the same time, it's not merely personal. It's not just telling him something about his relationship with his wife. This synchronicity is also telling him about something to do with the secret of the alchemical gold and the recipe for producing it. So it's personal and archetypal interleaved in a environmental synchronicity. And he knows he's seen something incredible, something spiritual. In my fireplace, I burn coals, which, because of their round and regular shape, are called monks' heads. One day, when the fire is nearly extinguished, I take out a mass of coal of fantastic shape. It resembles a cock's head, with a splendid comb joined to what looks like a human trunk with twisted limbs. It might have been a demon from some medieval witch's sabbath. The second day, I take out again a fine group of 2 gnomes or drunken dwarfs, who embrace each other while their clothes flutter in the wind. It is a masterpiece of primitive culture. The third day, it is a Madonna and Child in the Byzantine style, of incomparable beauty and outline. After I have drawn copies of all 3 in black chalk, I place them on my table. A friendly painter visits me. He regards the 3 statuettes with growing curiosity and asks who has made them. In order to try him, I mention the name of a Norwegian sculptor. No, he says, I should rather be inclined to ascribe them to Kittelsen, the famous illustrator of the Swedish legends. I do not believe in demons, and yet I wish to see the impression which my little figures make on the sparrows, who generally take their crumbs from my windowsill. So I place them there. The sparrows are frightened and remain aloof. There is then some likeness in the figures, which they can distinguish, and some reality in this conjunction of dead material and fire. The sun, as it warms my little figures, makes the demon with the cock's head collapse. This reminds me of the country people's saying that if the dwarfs wait too long till sunrise, they die. Okay, so this is really a form of automatic drawing, as it were. The fire is forming coals into little accidental statues, which he then identifies with archetypal material. He wonders about the objectivity of those associations, and so he devises a little series of soft tests to see if other people perceive the correspondence. And so first he presents them to his painter friend as if they were things made by a human. In fact, they're formed by this sort of undead process of the fire. And he gets a little bit of information by that because the painter intuitively associates them with a particular illustrator who's known for working with mythic archetypal material. So the fact that these particular lumps of coal look like things that are archetypal is confirmed to be somewhat objective by the ideation of his friend. He then kicks it down to like an animal mind, as it were, to get the sparrows' opinions on these things. And even the sparrows seem to treat them as if they are dangerous little creatures. So he says, there is then some likeness in the figures which they can distinguish, some reality in this conjunction of dead material and fire. He's wondering if he's not just hallucinating the whole thing, and if someone else wouldn't look at this thing and say, yeah, I don't really see it. So he puts it to the test of an external human brain and an external bird brain. That's meant to be a beak. There are some bird legs. And they both seem to confirm, no, there's some degree of objectivity in this projection. That's the kind of thing that's motivated me to make my YouTube channel, and to show these regions of these films that seem to align with images of 9/11. I'm kind of asking the public, generally speaking, like, do you see this? Does this look like an objective correspondence to you? Or am I just seeing nothing and nothing? Or rather, something and nothing. And then finally, some other process happens, which is just a thing that would happen. The sun warms the figures, and the head collapses. But then, in August's mind, this is like the fulfillment of an expected narrative. A story that goes along with the idea of the dwarf, So it all gets related back to this mythic sort of context. So now here we have the sort of the payoff of this magical operation he was performing before, to do with his daughter. In the course of the spring, while I was feeling depressed by my own and my friends' untoward destiny, I received a letter from the children of my first marriage, informing me that they had been very ill in hospital. When I compared the time of their illness with my mischievous attempt at magic, I was alarmed. I had frivolously played with hidden forces, and now my evil purpose, guided by an unseen hand, had reached its goal and struck my heart. I do not excuse myself, and only ask the reader to remember this fact, in case he should ever be inclined to practice magic, especially those forms of it called wizardry, or more properly witchcraft, and whose reality has been placed beyond all doubt by Dorocus. Dorocus was a parapsychologist, in fact, who wrote during the 1800s. But again, look at how he determines that this magic was successful. It's about a simultaneity, that at the same time that he was working this process, his children were ill in a hospital. It's about a happening together in time, an acausal relation. So very much a synchronicity. Okay, here's something about how he came into contact with Swedenborg's writings. I won't get into this for this video, but he says it became his gospel, caused me to enter a close connection with the other world. These are the things that I felt when I discovered Jung and the Red Book. Jung was like my Swedenborg in this way. I was going through this intense process. These unconscious archetypal contents were flooding into my awareness. This kind of projection vision was switching on in an intense way. I didn't know what to do with it. Jung gave me the framework in which to begin to understand that stuff, and I had an absolutely religious devotion to it. It became my gospel. Very good way to put it. And he says here, my friends Orfila and Swedenborg protected, encouraged, and chastised me. They did not appear to me in dreams or waking visions, but in small daily occurrences showed me that they did not leave me alone in the vicissitudes of life. The spirits had become naturalistic, like the times, which were no longer content with visions. Here we have another thing that just reads exactly like a Synchead diary entry, I repeat that I have never been plagued by visions, but actual objects sometimes seem to me to assume a human shape in a grandiose style. Thus, one day, the cushion which my head had been pressing during a midday siesta looks like a marble head carved in the style of Michelangelo. One evening, when I return home in the company of the double of the American empiric doctor, that's this person that he's hanging out with at this point in the novel, who himself is involved in a weird synchronicity that he perceives. This friend looks exactly like a famous American doctor, apparently. So there's a weird, doppelganger, aspect to his relationship with this friend. So he says, in the company of the double of the American empiric doctor, I discover in the half shadow of the alcove where my bed is what looks like a gigantic Zeus reposing on it. Before this unexpected sight, my friend remains seized with an almost religious fear. His artistic eye comprehends at once the beauty of the outline. He's an artist, this guy, a painter, I think. There is a great forgotten art, he says. Born again. That is where we ought to learn drawing. The more one looks at it, the more lifelike and terrible it appears. Obviously, the spirits have become realists, like the rest of us mortals. It is no mere accident, for on certain days the cushion takes the shape of terrible monsters, such as Gothic dragons and serpents. And one night, after I have spent a hilarious evening, I am greeted on my return by a medieval demon, a devil with horned head and other appurtenances. I was not at all frightened. It looked so natural, but it also made on my mind the impression of something abnormal and unearthly. When I invited my friend the sculptor to look at it, he was not at all astonished, and called me into his studio, where a pencil sketch hanging on the wall surprised me by its grace of outline. "Where have you got that from?" I asked. "A Madonna, isn't it?" "Yes, a Madonna of Versailles, copied from the floating plants in a Swiss lake. A new discovered art of nature. Naturalistic clairvoyance. Why blame naturalism when it introduces a new art full of capacities of growth and development? The old gods return, and the watchword of the poets and artists, back to Pan, has roused such a strong echo that nature has awoken from her long sleep of centuries. Nothing can exist on earth without the concurrence of the powers. Now naturalism did once exist, therefore it ought to be, and what ought it obviously to be? A newborn harmony of matter and spirit. The sculptor is a seer. He tells me that he has seen Orpheus and Christ side by side in a block of stone, and adds that he intends to return there and use them as models for a group for the salon. As I went down to the Rue de Rene one evening with the same seer, he drew my attention to a bookshop window where colored lithographs were exhibited. They represented fantastic scenes with human bodies whose heads were replaced by pansies. In spite of my botanical observations, I had never before seen the likeness between the pansy and the human face. My friend seemed greatly surprised at it. "Only think," he said. "When I came home last evening, the pansies in my window box looked at me like so many human faces. I thought it was a hallucination of my overexcited nerves. And here are these pictures drawn a long time ago. It is then a fact and no illusion, for this unknown artist has made the same discovery before me. We make progress in the art of vision. And this time it is I who discover a Napoleon, with his marshals and the cupola of the dome of the Hôtel des Invalides. When one comes from Montparnasse to the Boulevard des Invalides, one sees above the Rue Audinot the cupola, the corbels, and cornices of the substructure of the cupola displayed in the full light of the setting sun, and apparently assuming human forms which appear more or less distant according to the point of observation from which they are viewed. There are Napoleon, Bernardotti, Berthier, and my friend copies them after nature. How would you explain this phenomenon, he asks. Explain? Has one ever explained anything by replacing one heap of words with another heap of words? You don't think, then, that the architect has worked according to a hidden plan? Listen, my friend. Jules Mansard, who built the dome in 1706, could not well have foreseen the silhouette of Napoleon, who was born in 1769. That is a sufficient answer. So, wow, I find this chapter just absolutely mind-blowing, because he's talking about this phenomenon of perceiving archetypal material in a projective way in external material. Things like the shapes formed in the shadows of pillows, shapes formed by natural processes in lakes, shadows and silhouettes on the roofs of buildings, and so on. And then his friend and him are recognizing two things about it. First of all, the fact that it's a massive source for artistic inspiration. And I do this all the time. My whole automatic drawing procedure is really based on that. I will lay down a bunch of lines very quickly and chaotically, and then try to project unconscious material into that chaos, and then pull that out and refine it. I haven't done any of this yet, but it's been a long-standing artistic ambition of mine to sort of photograph things like limestone and water that I see forming in shower curtains and things like that. When I see something interesting in there, to actually take a picture of that and then do a trace of it in Photoshop to like realize it and bring it out into a concrete image. That's a style of seeing that goes at least back to my adolescence. I remember spending long periods of time looking specifically at drops of water on shower curtains and perceiving all kinds of creatures and scenes and archetypal material within them. And then it even gets tied in here with this sort of temporally nonlinear context when they realize that they're kind of wondering, like, gosh, this looks just like Napoleon. It looks so much like Napoleon that maybe we ought to think that the designer of this building built that structure into the building for us to see. But then August responds with, well, that's not possible because this building was built way before Napoleon was alive. So what does that mean then? And that is directly analogous to what's going on here in the sync community when we find visual fragments or other kinds of high-dimensional coincidences to do with 9/11 and other world historical events in films that were released prior to the event. It's just like that. There's a funny projective phenomenon that is signifying in the direction of some event so strongly that you almost can't imagine it was accidental. Surely this filmmaker was trying to say something about 9/11 here, and yet couldn't be, because 9/11 hasn't happened yet. And so, God, I think I nearly jumped out of my chair when I read this section of Inferno, because it was just like, wow. We think about what we're doing here as like a really cutting-edge thing, and it is in a way, but it's been the cutting edge for a while. It at least goes back here to the 1800s with stuff that this person was experiencing, and asking just the same questions and going through just the same sorts of mental pains about where and how do we locate this kind of perception and this kind of experience. What is its utility? What are its limitations? What does it mean? We're still grappling with that a century later. And then, in connection with the opening up of this imaginal sight, this projective form of seeing, August begins to experience precognitive dreams. And this is something that we've also observed in the sync community, that the closer you come into connection with this weird thing, the more generally parapsychologically fused modes of experience start presenting themselves in your life. So he says, often I have dreams at night, and these dreams prognosticate my future, warn me against dangers, and reveal to me secrets. For instance, a long-deceased friend appears to me in a dream, and shows me a piece of money of uncommon size. On my asking where this remarkable piece came from, he answers from America, and disappears. The next day, I receive a letter from America, from a friend whom I had heard nothing of for 20 years, informing me that an order in connection with the Chicago exhibition had been following me in vain all over Europe. It carried with it an honorarium of 12,000 francs, an enormous sum for me in my desperate circumstances, which I could very easily find use for. This 12,000 francs would have secured my future, and no one besides myself would have guessed that the loss of this money was a punishment for an evil deed which I had committed out of anger at the treachery of a literary colleague. In another dream of wider significance, I saw Jonas lie, with a gilt bronze clock curiously ornamented. Some days later, when I went to walk on the Boulevard Saint-Michel, a watchmaker's shop window attracted my attention. "Jonas Lie's clock!" I exclaimed aloud. It was indeed the same. It was crowned by a celestial globe on which two female figures leaned. The works were supported by 4 pillars, and on the globe a date indicator pointed to the 13th of August, that being his name. And 13 being a very Synchy, superstitious number. And I'll just leave that section without comment. Those are very precoggy dreams. Quite impressive in my view. And then finally, I want to end this little dive into basically the first quarter of Inferno. I've just pulled sort of from the first 20 or 30 pages or something of this book. This mention of the book of Job. August says, "The book of Job and the lamentations of Jeremiah comfort me, for at any rate there is a certain resemblance between Job's lot and mine. Am I not smitten with incurable boils? Am I not visited with poverty and forsaken by my friends? I go blackened, but not by the sun. I am a brother to dragons and a companion to ostriches. My skin is black and falleth from me, and my bones are burned with heat. My harp is turned to mourning, and my pipe unto the voice of them that weep." Thus Job and Jeremiah, with 2 words, fathoms the depth of my sadness. I forget prosperity. What was it that Salant said about borderline minds? Answer to Job is a mine of information about the overwhelming affects suffered by the borderline patient. Jung's reflections upon the psychological significance of Yahweh, his affects and behavior, are a veritable description of what is known today as the borderline personality. It's no wonder that August was interested in Job. I think we all find our way there in one way or another, even if it's not to that particular story. Maybe you find your way to Pinocchio, which captures a different aspect of the borderline experience. But it's just another portion of this book that I find immediately telling. So, okay, there's an introduction to August Strindberg. I really want to read a lot more of his work. But where does this leave us now, at the end of this probably very long video? So I'm actually not sure how to end this video. Partly because I think this is the beginning of a discussion. The intersection of these things, alchemy, borderline, synchronicity, is very, very rich. And there's much, much more to be said about it and to understand about it, even just from the standpoint of things I think I already understand that I might like to share, but certainly from the standpoint of things I do not yet understand. And I hope that by continuing to make videos like this, we'll be able to crack these issues open a little wider. One thing that I think I will just say in closing, because I'm not sure exactly what else to say, I don't feel really capable at the moment of making a big summarizing conclusion for this video, is to say that borderline personality is a disorder, but it is also a unique and valid way of seeing. And that if you can successfully go through the alchemical loop and heal the parts of this condition that are leading to suboptimal behavior, and retain the parts of it that provide one with special insight into the Numinosum and the workings of the unconscious, the entire game can be changed thereby. You know, it's a process. I feel today that my borderline is much healthier than it was at other points in my life. 2 things have been helpful there for me. One has been all the alchemical stuff and the Jungian stuff. That has been essential for rehabilitating that personal self. And today, my personal self is functional. It's doing its job more or less. It is unifying those complexes. It is finding commonality between them. It is supplying me with a more stable and coherent, persistent sense of identity. No, it's not like the normals, but it's working okay for me, and it's also allowing me to be less frightening and hurtful to the normals, I would say, and also to myself. I would say that in combination with that, though, things out of, for instance, dialectical behavior therapy, and just other things that have to do with emotional processing and centering one's experience in the present. In DBT, we talk a lot about the so-called wise mind and so on. These have been very helpful for the other side of this, which is about taming an overactive amygdala. To me, these form kind of the two cruxes of the condition, really. There's a very atypical self that, and then that goes along with these experiences of synchronicity and all this other stuff that's very supercharged in our psychology. The proximity of the archetypes is very close. The world of the dead is very close. That personal self that insulates a bit against that is transparent and wonky. So we have that, but then we also have this issue of the overwhelming flood of affect and of emotion, often very negative emotion. And the Jungian material is a little bit helpful for that, but less so. It's more practically oriented stuff that's going to help with that. And for that, DBT is really the best thing that currently exists. By the way, in dialectical behavior therapy, dialectics pertains to the synthesizing of opposites. And so there's a immediate connection there with the alchemical path, which is also about synthesizing opposites. It's no wonder, you see, that a borderline would find their way to alchemy as a spiritual system. It's a very, very good religion to have. If you're a borderline, it's actually helpful. It gives you some keys about how to think about balancing opposites in your psychology, which is also what modern DBT can give you. DBT was also, by the way, created by a borderline, Marsha Linehan, who created the system, which today is I think the only acknowledged evidence-based therapy for borderline that works. She herself is a borderline and discovered that sort of along the process of literally writing the book on DBT and working with her borderline patients. And so I think that a synthesis of DBT and Jungian techniques of the sort outlined by Salant in this book, it's kind of specifically, this is about active imagination for healing borderline. Those two things together make a really, really good course of treatment that will hopefully leave you intact also in the ways that matter. Because we don't want to kill the parts of ourselves that are authentically spiritual and that really are, in my view, connected to the world of the dead and the hidden powers and all the rest of it. I don't think that the pathology of borderline has to do with the perception of that stuff. It's kind of almost like an accident or something that borderline also puts one into contact with the Numinosum and with mystical experience. It's really a gift. It's one of the kind of sunny sides of a thing that has many negative sides. And what does Salant say about it in here again? He says, if we undervalue the borderline patient's psychotic mechanisms, we will lose the self, and at best gain an ego with an enhanced capacity for repression. Well, exactly. And so anyway, with that, I think I'm going to sign off. And I will see you all in the future. See you later.
Fuck you can say what you will about her. Say